Before the pyramids, before pharaohs had names, the earth was already carved by hands we've forgotten. Civilizations rose from mud, bone, blood, and vanished without a whisper, but they left shadows. Scars, myths mistaken for madness. From desert engineers to skull cults, this is the world before Egypt. 30 ancient cultures. Some real, some half-remembered, some that may never have existed, but all of them terrifying in their extremity. Welcome to the origin story of civilization, the one we buried too deep to remember. This is 30 terrifying pre-Egypt civilizations. If ancient history that feels more like science fiction is your thing, go ahead and subscribe. We dive deep every week. And hey, while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments and what time is it right now? Let's see how far this timeline stretches. Tasian culture. Before pyramids, before pharaohs, before even the idea of Egypt existed, there was the Tasian culture, a shadow flickering in the prehistoric dark. Around 4,500 BCE, in what would one day become Upper Egypt, the Tasian people emerged like whispers from the desert wind. No cities, no writing, just bone tools, pottery that looked like it was scorched in a funeral pyre, and a legacy buried under 6,000 years of Nile silt. This wasn't civilization as we know it. This was prelude. Imagine it. A narrow ribbon of life clinging to the Nile while the desert pressed in like a dying god's last breath. The Tasian people didn't build monuments. They left no palaces. But they did something far stranger. They buried their dead with a level of care that screams, these people feared something. Something after death. Or before it. We find their graves shallow but intentional. The bodies curled like sleeping infants, eyes closed, wrapped in matting or animal skins, always facing west, toward the land of the dead. And the pottery, the pottery is where things get weird. Tasian ceramics weren't crude. They were obsessively polished, red-slipped, then fired in open flames that left the rims charred black. Archaeologists call it black-topped red ware, but it looks less like kitchenware and more like ritual armor, like something made to feed gods or fend them off. Here's the thing. This culture seems to have appeared suddenly, not as a slow evolution from the Neolithic farmers before them, but like a sudden mutation, a jump cut in human development. One moment you have small-scale subsistence communities, and the next, Tasian burials, Tasian black-topped pottery, Tasian tools made from hippo ivory. Something triggered it. A trauma? A revelation? A contact? We'll never know. Their language is lost. Their myths have turned to dust, but their fingerprints are on everything that came after. You can trace the line from Tasian grave goods to the royal tombs of the pharaohs like a slow crescendo. Their burial poses would echo into dynasties. Their ceramic style would be adopted, modified, ritualized. But the original Tasian vision? It remains feral, unsmoothed, uneased. These were people staring into the void of an unshaped world and trying desperately to make it speak back. They hunted with flint-tipped spears. They wore beads carved from shells dragged hundreds of miles across desert trade paths. They lived in tight-knit clusters near the floodplains, and when the Nile rose too high or not high enough, they watched loved ones vanish. And still, they made art. They made meaning. In a world where nature wasn't just cruel, it was mythic. And then, as suddenly as they emerged, the Tasian faded. They didn't collapse. They were subsumed, absorbed into something newer, stronger, stranger. Another culture with better tools, different gods, new ideas about what it meant to live and die in the valley of the Nile. The Tasian didn't resist. Or maybe they did, and their resistance was so thoroughly erased we'll never find a trace. All we know is that within a few generations, their pottery style was being copied, their burial customs adopted, and the Tasian name? Forgotten, until modern archaeology dug it back up. But here's the kicker. Tasian culture wasn't just the first spark of Egypt. It may have been one of the oldest precursors to organized civilization anywhere on Earth. We're talking about a group that emerged around the same time as the Ubaid culture in Mesopotamia, and possibly before Sumer had its first gods carved in clay. And yet, no monuments, no inscriptions, just the feeling that something old, something sacred, and maybe something terrifying passed through this narrow strip of Nile Valley. A ghost culture. Not quite alive, not quite dead. But their shadow still falls over everything that followed. And just when the Nile had tasted its first rituals of the dead, another force rose behind them, one with brighter pigments, sharper tools, and an even more unsettling intimacy with the afterlife. The Bedarian were coming, and they brought the dead with them. Bedarian culture. The Bedarians didn't just live, they elevated life, and death, and everything in between. Rising in Upper Egypt around 4400 BCE, the Bedarian culture was the next iteration of a slow-burning transformation, an ancient operating system upgrade coated in blood, bone, and sun-baked clay. They were successors to the Tasian in geography, but not in spirit, because the Bedarians didn't just bury the dead. They dressed them. Imagine this, a woman curled on her side, cradled in a shallow grave, her arms tucked, knees drawn in fetal-like repose, eyes closed under layers of linen, around her neck a necklace of turquoise, on her arms ivory bangles, beneath her skull a soft mat of woven reeds. She's not forgotten, she's prepared, as if the next world was just a more prestigious version of this one. The Bedarian people were the first in Egypt to start treating death like a promotion. Their graves, scattered across sites like El Badari and Mostagedda, speak with eerie clarity. Bodies interred with grave goods, cosmetics, combs, flint blades, baskets, beads, amulets, objects too personal to be pragmatic, too intentional to be random. They weren't just dumping tools into graves, they were packing for a journey. The Bedarians may not have had writing, but they had narrative. You can feel it in the ritual. You can almost see the story they told themselves, that this life was a prelude to another, and that death was a gate, not a wall. But the Bedarians weren't all mystics and mortuary aesthetics. They were also pioneers. They practiced agriculture, growing wheat and barley, raising cattle and sheep, even managing irrigation in its infancy. This wasn't just survival, it was investment. A society starting to believe that tomorrow would come and that it was worth planning for. And then there's the pottery. Bedarian ceramics didn't just borrow from the Tasian, they perfected them, finely made, thin-walled vessels with a polished red slip and that same black-topped edge, but now with more variety, more flair. Some were incised with lines, others were painted, and some were so delicate and finely made that archaeologists initially thought they had to be imported. Nope, just early excellence. And then there's her. We don't know her name, we never will, but we know her face. Her bones were found in a Bedarian cemetery, preserved in the dry earth for over 6,000 years. And when scientists reconstructed her features, they found something haunting. High cheekbones, wide eyes, a straight nose, a face you could pass on the street today. The past, it turns out, is never as far away as it feels. But it wasn't all noble graves and sacred wheat. The Bedarians lived hard. Their skeletons show signs of nutritional stress, arthritis, trauma. Life was brutal. You didn't get old unless you were lucky or powerful. And speaking of power, the Bedarian graves weren't equal. Some were deeper, richer, more elaborate. Some had grave goods so fine, so foreign lapis from Afghanistan, shells from the Red Sea, obsidian from Ethiopia that they screamed status. Not everyone was a peasant farmer. Some were traders, chiefs, proto-priests. The seeds of hierarchy were here. sprouting in the dust. And that's the most unsettling part. For all their elegance, all their spiritual preparation, the Bedarians were beginning to stratify. Society was tilting. Some lives were worth more than others. And death, well, death reflected that. The rich went west with style. The poor just went. The Bedarian era was short-lived, maybe 600 years, give or take. And when it ended, it didn't crash. It morphed into something bigger, something more structured. The Bedarian didn't vanish. They evolved into what we now call the Amratian, or Naqada I culture. The river was rising, the rituals were tightening, the dead were getting better graves, and the living were dreaming of thrones. The Bedarians laid the foundation for what would eventually become divine kingship, but they didn't rule. The next people? They were different. They started to build power vertically. They carved the first steps toward dynasties, toward empires, toward names carved into stone so deeply they could still kill 5,000 years later. The Amratian were coming. And they had plans. Amratian, Naqada I. It begins with a ripple in the sand, a new rhythm on the Nile, a sharpening of purpose. By around 4,300 BCE, the Amratian culture, also known as Naqada I, emerged like a whisper turning into a war drum. The Bedarians had offered a taste of the afterlife. The Amratians, they built the stairs. This was the moment when prehistory started shifting its weight. The Amratians didn't just bury their dead with care, they buried them with ambition. Their world was still without writing, still without metal, still bound by the slow curve of the sun and the flooding Nile. But now, the people were beginning to align themselves towards something higher, or someone. Because the Amratians brought hierarchy into the daylight, their graves didn't just suggest inequality, they formalized it. The rich were buried with pallets for grinding malachite into paint, with combs shaped like birds, with hippo ivory carved so finely it practically hummed. The poor, a shallow pit, if that. And then came the mace heads. Stone, pear-shaped, ceremonial. Not for hunting, not for farming. These were objects of violence and symbolism. You didn't just carry one of these because you were strong. You carried one because people believed you should. Because you were more than a man. You were the man. Power was beginning to solidify. The Amratians stretched from El Amra in the south to Abydos and Naqada, and their reach extended beyond. We know this not just from graves, but from trade. Amratian artisans were producing pottery on an industrial level, polished redware, black-topped like their ancestors, but now joined by white cross-lined ceramics. Intricate patterns painted in creamy pigment, zigzags and stick figures and abstract waves. These weren't doodles. They were statements. Boats became a recurring motif, long, curved vessels with oars and cabins. Some scholars believe these were depictions of funerary boats, carrying the dead across the Nile to the land of the West. Others think they may have been proto-royal barges, foreshadowing the grand solar vessels of later pharaohs. Either way, the message was clear. The Amratians saw life as a journey, and they were planning for more than just survival. They were networking. Trade routes crackled across the eastern desert and down into Nubia. Obsidian, incense, gold. The Amratians weren't just making connections, they were laying down the arterial roads for a kingdom not yet born. A network of trust or coercion, probably both. And amidst this came the first artistic explosion in the region. Figurines of women with wide hips and stylized faces. Some scholars say these were fertility idols, others argue for goddesses, but maybe, just maybe, they were something else. Icons of power. Visions of life-making that transcended mere symbolism. After all, this was a culture where people were beginning to organize. You don't get workshops of similar pottery, identical tools, and mass-produced grave goods without structure, without leadership, without belief. And belief was starting to wear a face. The Amratians gave us some of the earliest hints of divine rulership. No inscriptions, not yet, but their burial complexes began to show early signs of centralized control. Groups of graves clustered around a single, dominant tomb. Not a pyramid, but a prototype, a social architecture. One man at the center, many in orbit. We don't know their names, but we know they had names. We know they had roles. And we know the living built their memory to last. Because the dead weren't just buried. They were housed. With grave offerings growing in number and complexity, the Amratians began constructing more permanent structures over the deceased. Mud brick chambers, early mastabas, a style of honoring the dead that would later morph into pyramid complexes. These weren't just graves, they were statements of continuity. My power doesn't die when I do. It lingers, it radiates. And then, there was the palette. Cosmetic palettes, once tools for grinding green eye paint, were now being shaped into animals, fish, turtles, even strange composite creatures. Decoration had crept in. Meaning was wrapping around function. Eventually, these would evolve into ceremonial masterpieces like the Narmer palette, still a few centuries away, that told stories in images, framing the ideology of statehood in stone. But the first strokes of that narrative began here. The Amratian culture didn't conquer the land. It mapped it. It linked people through symbols, through burial patterns, through the ever-deepening belief that death wasn't an end, it was an elevation, and only a few were destined to rise. But for those who did, they rose in style. And when the sun set over the Naqada sky, it wasn't just tombs that cast shadows, it was the idea of kingship itself, formless, faceless but waiting. And soon, very soon, it would get a face, and a name, and a taste for conquest. Because after the Amratians faded into their own rituals, something darker and more organized rose behind them. The Gerzeans. And they didn't wait for the afterlife. They dragged it down into the present. Gerzean. Naqada II. By 3600 BCE, the Nile had turned red. Not with blood, at least. Not yet, but with a deeper, symbolic shift. The Amratians had flirted with power. The Gerzeans, or Naqada II culture, married it. Hard. This was no longer just burial culture and craft networks. This was something else. This was pre-dynastic Egypt reaching puberty. And it came with mood swings, sharp ones. Suddenly, art wasn't just decorative, it was declarative. Figures now stood stiff and forward-facing, arms to sides, wide-eyed, like they knew someone was watching. Pottery bloomed with motifs not of farming or fertility, but of dominance. Boats with rows of armed men, prisoners with hands bound behind them, and one recurring, unmistakable shape, the crown. That wasn't just a coincidence, that was foreshadowing. The Gerzean period introduced the symbolic language of kingship before the kings themselves had names. And they didn't just flirt with symbolism, they weaponized it. If the Amratians laid the spiritual tracks, the Gerzeans were the oncoming train. They expanded everything. The trade networks stretched further into Nubia, out into the Levant, even touching the fringes of Mesopotamia. The Nile was no longer just a source of life, it was a conduit of influence. Materials flowed up and down, lapis, lazuli, cedar, obsidian, ivory. But more importantly, ideas flowed with them. Techniques, shapes, rituals, power, in the form of aesthetics. Gerzean grave goods began to include combs shaped like double-headed animals, ceremonial maces, and even stone vases carved with what could only be interpreted as scenes, not just symbols, but stories. Warfare, subjugation, order over chaos. The cosmic marketing campaign had begun. And then there was the architecture. Graves became complex subterranean chambers with multiple rooms, grave goods in precise arrangements, and grave differentiation that bordered on divine distinction. Some were buried with a few beads. Others had whole assemblages of tools, weapons, amulets, and imported goods. The social pyramid hadn't just appeared, it was already stacking bodies. And the top? The ones buried in the largest, most decorated tombs, those weren't just important people. They were pre-pharaohs, not in name, but in function. They ruled in life, they commanded in death. And most unsettling of all, they seemed to think it would never stop. The Gerzean worldview was becoming vertical. Heaven above, death below, order in the middle, and someone had to hold the center. That someone was no longer just a tribal leader. They were a god in waiting. The Gerzeans began producing the earliest examples of elite iconography. Figures holding crooks and flails, boats surrounded by symbols of control, and stylized representations of enemies being stomped or speared. The culture had started using art to write power into memory, and though writing hadn't arrived yet, the narrative was being chiseled into every tomb wall and polished into every artifact. Their reach extended, their myths sharpened. The dead were no longer simply buried, they were enthroned in the sand. But here's where things really start to turn. For all the Gerzeans' growing power, for all their symbols and graves and weapons, there was something else. Something off. Because in many tombs, archaeologists started finding replica weapons not for use, but for display. Ceremonial blades, symbolic maces, and that suggests something unsettling. They may have begun to believe that the symbol mattered more than the thing, that a painted flail was just as effective as a real one so long as people believed it. In other words, the culture had started building propaganda. Now that's terrifying, because once you start equating power with its image, you've entered dangerous territory. You've started playing with illusion, with divine theatrics. And the Gerzeans weren't subtle about it. Their pottery began to feature increasingly abstract designs, interlocked spirals, serpent shapes, falcon-like birds. A visual language, just on the edge of becoming literal. A few centuries later, those images would turn into hieroglyphs. But here, they were still raw, still charged with mystery. And those boats? They multiplied, painted, carved, etched, always full of men, always pointed west. The dead were riding somewhere, and someone, something, was waiting on the other side. But the Gerzeans weren't content to wait for the next world. They were starting to build a heaven here. Settlement sites exploded in scale. Fortified structures appeared. Large, organized towns like Hierakonpolis grew teeth, walls, guards, surplus storage. This wasn't just survival. This was statecraft in embryonic form. And somewhere in that bubbling cauldron of politics and proto-religion, a new kind of leader emerged. One not content with local rule. One who looked north and saw an entire kingdom waiting to be carved from the Nile's spine. The Gerzean culture was about to give way to something sharper, colder, more final. The sacred had been weaponized. The dead now walked with scepters, and the men who buried them were ready to wear crowns. What came next wasn't just a culture. It was unification. It was conquest. It was the Naqada III, and it was already sharpening its knives. Naqada III, Semainean. By 3150 BCE, the desert had gone silent, but not from peace. The silence came after something had ended. The Gerzean world had turned itself into a mirror of myth and dominance. But the Naqada III culture, also called the Semainean, was the moment the mirror shattered. This was no longer the dress rehearsal. This was the show. Forget gentle trade. Forget symbolic weapons. Naqada III was unification by blade. It was where the ancient world shifted from tribes to thrones, where mythology slammed into militarization, where power got a name, a face, a crown, and an army. And no, it didn't start with pyramids. It started with blood. At this stage, Egypt was still fragmented. Dozens of local polities huddled along the Nile like bones in a spine. Each had its own elite, its own totems, its own sacred dead. But something had changed in the current. One of these groups, probably from the south, began consolidating, quietly at first, then violently. We find the clues buried in cemeteries and carved into stone pallets, scenes of decapitated enemies, bound prisoners, falcons ripping through human forms. It wasn't metaphor, it was policy. The most infamous of these artifacts is the Narmer pallet, a heavy, shield-shaped slate found at Hierakonpolis. On it, a single figure towers over everyone. He wears the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side, the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other. He smashes skulls, he inspects rows of beheaded corpses, and most importantly, he stands alone. No name. Just power. This was Naqada III's final form, proto-statehood. A society that had learned how to use ideology like architecture and violence like ceremony. But don't think it was all war, because behind every smashed head was a bureaucrat. Naqada III was the beginning of centralized control. We see seal impressions now, official stamps, branding goods, and ownership, storage pits full of grain, wine, oils, clay labels tied with string, used to track inventory. No writing yet, not quite, but administration had arrived. And where there's bureaucracy, there's surplus. And where there's surplus, there's a ruling class. The Naqada III elite weren't tribal chiefs. They were rulers, full stop. Not gods yet, but their fingers were brushing the divine. They wore patterned kilts, donned animal skins, held crooks and flails, and controlled vast labor forces. The tombs they built, especially at sites like Abydos and Naqada, were not graves. They were complexes. Massive rectangular enclosures, mud brick architecture, burials so large and so meticulously planned they needed logistical infrastructure. Some tombs even came with satellite graves, suggesting the servants didn't just serve the living. They served in death too. Yeah. The Naqada III culture might have pioneered ritual human sacrifice in Egypt. Bodies interred beside the elite, often bound, sometimes beheaded, laid out like furniture in a cosmic apartment. Their purpose? To accompany the dead ruler into the next life. Or maybe just to prove he could. Terrifying, yes, but efficient. These were societies streamlining their own mythologies, wrapping ritual, governance, and violence into a single coherent system, then branding it with symbols. The earliest hieroglyphs began to appear in this era. No full sentences yet, but names, titles, emblems of office. The Serek, a rectangular glyph representing a palace facade topped by a falcon, was the badge of the king. Inside the Serek, a name, sometimes Narmer, sometimes Scorpion, sometimes someone lost to time. Each one a step toward pharaonic identity. The state wasn't fully born yet, but it was crowning. You could feel it in the cities, Hierakonpolis, Naqada, Abydos. These weren't just towns, they were power centers, each competing for control of the Nile's flow. And the Nile? It was watching. Because as the south rose, the north noticed. The delta had its own cultures, its own leaders, but by the late Naqada III period, someone from the south had marched in and claimed it, unified it, named it. That name was Egypt, and its first ruler officially was Narmer, or maybe Menes, or maybe both, historians argue. But what's clear is this: the Naqada III culture didn't just transition into history, it created it. By the time the last of its rulers took the throne, the concept of divine kingship had hardened like obsidian. Egypt would now be ruled by gods in human skin, by men who claimed eternity and built for it. But under that divine facade was a foundation older, darker, rawer. It was carved by Gerzean blades, polished by Amratian hands, and dreamed by Tasian ghosts. And yet, before all of them, before the burial rites and painted boats and falcon gods, there was something even older, something quieter. something still half sunken in the Nile marshes, where reeds whispered before men ever raised a banner. It was called Faiyum A, and it remembered when the Nile was still a question. Faiyum A culture. Before gods wore crowns and men became myth, before tombs turned into architecture and death into performance, there was just water, endless water, the kind that didn't ask permission, didn't bless or punish. It simply was, and nestled in one of its many quiet bends was the Faiyum A culture around 5000 BCE, a people so old they watched the Nile before Egypt even dreamed of itself. The Faiyum Depression wasn't yet the cultivated breadbasket it would one day become. It was something rawer, wilder. A shallow basin, swollen seasonally by the lake now called Qarun, fringed with reeds and marsh grasses and untamed fertility. The people who lived here, let's just call them what they were the first to listen. Because Faiyum A wasn't about monuments. It wasn't about conquest, or kings, or even divinity. It was about listening to land. It was agriculture whispered into existence. You won't find stone stelae or falcon motifs here. What you'll find are pits, baskets, granaries woven from palm fiber, carefully buried grains of emmer wheat and barley. Because what the Faiyum A people discovered was a dangerous idea. That you could grow time. Grain was more than food. It was memory. It was future. For the first time in the Nile Valley, people stopped roaming and started staying. The shift from foraging to farming wasn't fast or total, but it was irreversible. These people tethered themselves to the soil. And in doing so, they built a relationship with the Nile that would eventually bloom into empire. But not yet. Faiyum A lived low, subtle. Their homes were little more than reed huts, their tools, flint and bone. But even in this simplicity, there was strategy. They lived at the edge of abundance and collapse, tracking flood cycles, adjusting planting schedules. They stored food, managed surplus, danced on the knife's edge between subsistence and speculation. And perhaps most haunting of all, they didn't bury their dead in cemeteries. Or if they did, we haven't found them. What we have found are stray bones, isolated burials, and human remains scattered without obvious ritual. Was it exposure? Sky burial? Some rite we can no longer decode? It's unclear. But it suggests a worldview, unlike the mortuary-obsessed cultures that came later. To Faiyum A, death may not have needed a stage. Maybe the ancestors lived in the lake, or the wind, or nowhere at all. But don't mistake subtlety for weakness. This culture persisted for centuries. In some ways, it outlasted its flashier descendants. While the Upper Egyptian cultures were rising and falling, being absorbed into kingdoms and erased by dynasties, the Faiyum Basin kept on quietly growing food, storing grain, surviving. And they weren't alone. They had contact with other early cultures. Flint tools suggest trade or shared technique with Merimde and Bedarian peoples. Beads and ceramics hint at long-distance exchange. But the Faiyum A stayed distinct. They didn't rise to power, but they stayed. Which, honestly, might be more terrifying than conquest. Because this was a people who figured out how to live in rhythm with a force, the Nile that later Egyptians had to deify just to explain. The Faiyum A didn't need gods. They had flood calendars. Not written ones, lived ones. Passed down through the planting, the harvesting, the watching of birds and insects and mud cracks in the ground. Their calendar was the land itself. No temples, no priests, just observation, repetition, survival. They created what would become the agricultural backbone of Egypt. Not in grandeur, but in practice. And then, like mist, they faded. We don't know how, or why. Maybe they were absorbed into more dominant groups migrating in from the south or west. Maybe the lake receded. Maybe they just kept living, gradually morphing into something we later renamed. The record goes quiet. But their fingerprints stayed. In every granary built in the shadow of a pyramid, in every field flooded by shaduf or canal, in every loaf of bread baked for an offering table, you'll find the ghost of Faiyum A. And as they dissolved into the reeds of history, another culture rose, just downstream one with a different flavor, not subtle, not quiet. A people who planted themselves in the delta and didn't listen, they announced themselves. Their name was Merimde Beni Salama, and they didn't just learn from the Nile, they shaped it. Merimde Beni Salama. At first glance, Merimde Beni Salama doesn't look like much. A scattering of shallow pits, sun-baked foundations, a few flint blades left behind like breadcrumbs in the Nile Delta's sand. But look closer, and you'll see something monumental, not in stone, but in intention. Because around 4,800 BCE, long before kings carved their names into granite, the people of Merimde did something far more radical. They stayed. Permanent settlement. It sounds mundane today, but back then, it was heresy. Until this point, most human groups along the Nile had been seasonal, migratory, adaptive. They moved with the rains, the herds, the floods. Even the Faiyum, pragmatic as they were, never fully rooted themselves. But at Merimde Beni Salama, something shifted. They didn't just live near the Nile, they built around it. This was one of the earliest known Neolithic village sites in the Delta region, and what it reveals is astonishing. A sprawling settlement hundreds of meters wide of mud huts and food pits, of storage units and tool-making stations. These weren't temporary shelters. These were homes. And to build a home, you need faith. Faith that the river won't betray you, that the land will yield, that your enemies or your gods will let you stay long enough to see your children's children inherit the grain you stored. Faith in tomorrow. That's what makes Merimde terrifying, because it means they gambled on permanence. And permanence is dangerous. It demands systems, management, hierarchy. You can't have a village without shared labor. You can't have storage without control. You can't have surplus without envy. The people of Merimde may not have built palaces or written laws, but they built the conditions for inequality. We see it in the tools, finely made flint sickles and blades, evidence of mass food production, specialized craftsmanship. Not everyone was just farming. Some were grinding grain, others shaping tools. Early signs of labor division, the first tectonic shift in social stratification. And here's where it gets wild. Merimde was peaceful, at least, on the surface. No signs of fortifications, no mass graves, no obvious warfare. But don't mistake the lack of violence for a lack of control. Social power doesn't always wear a blade. Sometimes it hides behind grain bins. Because when food becomes property, people become roles. Someone had to manage those resources. Someone had to decide who ate what and when. And in a world where rain and flood were unpredictable, where crops could fail and famine could come like a whisper, that power wasn't ceremonial. It was existential. And then there's the absence. Merimde gives us almost no burials. That alone should send a chill. Where are the dead? Were they buried elsewhere? Were they cremated? Or did they have a funerary custom so foreign to us that we can't even recognize it in the archaeological record? Whatever the reason, it implies a society with either a radically different spiritual view or a hidden layer of control. What if burial was a privilege? What if not everyone got remembered? We don't know, but the silence of the grave here is louder than any tomb wall. Then there's the strange architecture mud structures with circular or oval bases, some semi-subterranean, not houses in the classic sense, but more like cells, storage perhaps, living quarters. Or perhaps ritual enclosures. We can only speculate. And speaking of ritual, the Merimde site gives us hints, not proof, but shadows of symbolic life. Figurines shaped like humans, abstract forms carved from bone. Are they deities, dolls, fertility icons? no one agrees. But the presence of representation of trying to capture something beyond the functional is key. Because once people begin representing, they start storytelling. And once they start storytelling, they can build culture. Merimde Beni Salama may not have left behind ziggurats or golden masks, but it may have been one of the first places in North Africa where daily life became structured life. A rhythm not of season and survival, but of systems. And those systems would spread. The concept of permanent settlement, the control of surplus, the layering of labor roles, these weren't just practical, they were contagious. Merimde became a template, a whisper that would ripple through the delta, upstream, and eventually into the power centers of Upper Egypt. By the time later kingdoms came marching downriver with flails and falcon standards, they would find the delta already mapped, already managed, already primed. And while Merimde Beni Salama itself faded, its name lost, its dead unmarked, its core idea endured, that you could shape the river by staying still. But not everyone agreed with stillness. Further downstream, another group was rising, not a village, but a network, not just farmers, but traders. They didn't stay in one place. They moved. And in the movement, they built Merimde culture. The sands of prehistory are often still, frozen, lifeless. But the Merimde culture rising in the Nile Delta during the 5th millennium BCE was anything but. It didn't just settle the land, it activated it. A kinetic culture, a sprawling, pulsing, buzzing anomaly. Merimde was less a village and more an experiment in scale, and it didn't play by the rules. From roughly 4,800 to 4,300 BCE, the Merimde site grew into one of the largest prehistoric settlements in Egypt, hundreds of thousands of square meters of organized chaos. Unlike the compact circular huts of Merimde Beni Salama, Merimde gave us urban sprawl before cities. Clusters of oval and circular houses, hearths scattered like stars, and a density of living that feels alarmingly modern. This wasn't just a farmstead, it was a colony of intent. And behind it, a different mindset. Because Merimde didn't develop in isolation. It straddled the boundaries between Lower and Upper Egypt, between the desert and the delta, between foraging and farming, tradition and adaptation. This was a culture built on exchange, on mobility, on reaction. The Merimde people weren't just surviving the Nile, they were reading it. And what they read, they turned into structure. Gone were the scattered granaries and lone storage pits of earlier cultures. At Merimde, food was centralized. You get evidence of silos, of designated storage areas, of large-scale processing. The settlement was planned, not like a camp, but like a system. That alone is revolutionary, because it means people didn't just live here, they committed here. To settle in such density meant embracing not just agriculture, but negotiation. Shared space meant shared rules. Shared grain meant trust or control. Either way, Merimde had begun the slow, terrifying climb from community to society. And the signs are in the trash. Midden's massive heaps of discarded tools, bones, ceramics surround the site. These weren't the leftovers of a few families. They were industrial-level waste zones, filled with broken flint blades, shattered pots, and fish bones stacked in layers that tell you what was eaten, when, and by how many. Spoiler: a lot of people. This scale of consumption doesn't happen without specialization. Not everyone at Merimde was farming. Some were flint knappers. Others processed fish or grain. Others perhaps coordinated the mess. That's the birth of complexity. And with it comes the inevitable question: who's in charge? We don't have clear answers. No tombs, no crowns, no temples. But we do have hierarchy in function. Control over storage implies authority. Repetition of house types suggests regulation. The very density of life suggests a social contract written not in stone, but in proximity. And then there's the faces. For the first time, we see human figurines with expressive detail. Not the abstract fertility icons of earlier cultures, but heads with modeled noses, eyes, mouths, faces with personality, identity, maybe even status. Were they gods, ancestors, leaders? We don't know. But the human form had begun to matter in aesthetic and symbolic ways. In a culture without writing, this is how they spoke. Through form. And Merimde had a lot to say. They domesticated cattle, grew wheat and barley, hunted but focused on consistency. They learned to maximize the floodplains, to read the wet seasons, to time their plantings, to navigate the rhythms of a world that had no mercy, only patterns. And their tools reflect it. Flint sickles with serrated edges, polished axes, bone awls, ceramic vessels unpainted but practical, mass-produced and standardized. This wasn't luxury. This was function scaled to necessity. But not everything was practical. Because among the grain silos and hearths, they also buried their dead. Not many, not elaborately, but intentionally. Some graves contain children, others adults. Most are simple, shallow, oriented with a quiet kind of care. No grave goods, no markers, just the gesture of remembrance. It's subtle, but profound, because it means that even in this sprawling hive of survival, there was room for mourning, room for identity, for someone to say, this was a life, not just labor. But even as Merimde expanded, its borders frayed. By the end of its run, the settlement began to fragment. Less density, less order. Something changed: climate, politics, resource strain? We can't be sure. But the sprawl slowed. The rhythm broke, and Merimde, after hundreds of years, sank back into the earth it had once mastered. Yet its influence echoed. It taught the Nile people that density was possible. That coordination could come before kings. That grain could be managed, not just gathered. That survival didn't have to mean solitude. And when later civilizations came north, they found a delta that already understood systems. But before Egypt ever learned to call itself a kingdom, something older still stirred in the deep south. In Nubia, where blackened bones and butchered remains marked the land. Where death wasn't just honored, it was curated. They called it Qadan, and it was hungry. Qadan culture. If you walked along the Nile Valley between 13,000 and 9,000 BCE, you'd find no cities, no palaces, no temples. What you'd find instead were bone fields, fragments of lives caught in ambush. Death sprawled beside the river like spilled grain. This was the world of the Qadan culture. A place where early humanity pushed agriculture to its bleeding edge and got sliced open by it. Qadan wasn't a civilization in the traditional sense. It didn't leave pyramids or pottery. It didn't rise and fall with dynasties. It didn't even have houses as we'd recognize them. What it had was intensity. This was a people on the brink, riding the chaos of climate shifts, proto-agriculture, and territorial violence that reads today like the opening act of something darker. They lived in the stretch of the Nile that curves south into ancient Nubia, a place of extremes. Between flood and drought, feast and famine, the Qadan walked a razor's edge. They were some of the earliest to begin practicing systematic plant cultivation, not quite full-blown farming, but not foraging either. Something in between, something new. It was this in-between state that made them vulnerable. When you plant wild cereals, when you carve out zones for harvest, you're making a claim not just on the land, but on control. And when others pass through hungry, desperate, nomadic, they see your claim as an invitation to take. That's when the killing started. The Qadan cemeteries at Jebel Sahaba, one of their most famous sites, are brutal. Dozens of skeletons, many pierced with flint arrowheads, some with multiple embedded projectiles, others with crushed skulls, Broken limbs, fractured ribs, these weren't accidental deaths. They were massacres. One body had over a dozen arrowheads lodged in it. Others showed signs of defensive wounds, forearms snapped while trying to block. Some appear to have been struck down while fleeing. Children, women, elders. This wasn't battle. This was slaughter. And yet the Qadan persisted, because beneath all the blood, they were building something. They were the first in the region to develop tools for reaping sickles made of flint microliths, worn smooth from repetitive cutting. These tools weren't just for scavenging, they were for harvesting, repeatedly, with foresight. They left behind grindstones, mortars, pestles, everything needed to process cereals like wild barley and sorghum, and they weren't just surviving, they were committing to a place, to a pattern, to a lifestyle that demanded the cooperation of both humans and land. But land has rules, and those who try to bend it too early often snap. Farming didn't come easily to the Qadan. They lived through rapid climatic oscillations, times when the Nile's floods failed or when drought scorched the riverbanks. And when the crops failed, other humans became competition, threats, targets. It's no coincidence that the violence and the grain show up side by side. The Qadan weren't just early agriculturists. They were also among the first to experience the price of property. Once land becomes yours, someone else becomes the enemy. But even in this crucible of blood and soil, they developed culture. Not elaborate, not ornamental, but real. Their burials weren't random. Bodies were placed with care, sometimes accompanied by tools or shells, sometimes oriented consistently. There was belief here, maybe in an afterlife, maybe in memory, maybe just in dignity. And here's the haunting part. Despite all the violence, they returned to the same places, again and again. Like moths to flame, they reoccupied blood-soaked land, to grow, to die, to grow again. As if the Nile itself demanded sacrifice for its sustenance. This wasn't civilization yet. It was proto-civilization, a living draft of what Egypt would one day become. Sacred soil, sacred death, and the unending cycle of order carved from chaos. And then they disappeared. Not in fire, not in conquest, but in transformation. Some merged with new groups, others were erased by time, but the legacy remained in the practices they pioneered. Seasonal harvesting, semi-permanent settlement, structured burial. And in their absence, new people came. People who remembered the tools, but not the blood. Or maybe they remembered both. Further north, hugging the same riverbank, another group emerged, one that didn't fight as much, one that quietly sculpted its place along the Nile without arrows in its bones. But their memory is no less unsettling. Because while the Qadan died violently, the Sebilian faded with a whisper. But that whisper was carved in flint. Sebilian culture. Long before the Nile Valley echoed with hymns to Horus or the moans of dying kings, it rang with a quieter sound, the scrape of flint against bone, of stone against stone. This was the age of the Sebilian culture, roughly 13,000 to 10,000 BCE. A culture so old it feels more myth than memory, more mirage than history. But it was real, and it was sharp. The Sebilian weren't builders. They didn't farm. They didn't write. They didn't pray to gods in temples. They were flint knappers, fishers, nomads living in the brutal, beautiful in-between of Ice Age and flood season, just as the last glacial period was loosening its grip on the world. And their gift to history? Precision. Sebilian culture is named after the site of Kom near Sebil on the Nile. What archaeologists found there were tools, lots of them, but not crude ones. These weren't just rocks chipped for convenience. They were carefully crafted flint blades, microliths, scrapers, borers, tools that showed not only skill but intention. Like someone didn't just want to cut, they wanted to cut clean. And that's what makes the Sebilian terrifying. Because they were living on the edge of something climate, culture, time, and their survival depended not on raw strength but on exactness. These were people who lived by inches, who tracked animals across shifting terrain, who watched the river like it was a sleeping god that might wake up angry. The Sebilian flint industry evolved in 3 distinct phases, each one more refined than the last. They weren't just surviving, they were iterating, improving, sharpening their world down to a fraction of a millimeter. They left no temples, but they mastered their tools like priests. Their environment demanded it. This was Upper Egypt. Before Upper Egypt existed a land of seasonal abundance and sudden scarcity. Floodplains could bless or destroy. Herds could vanish overnight. The Nile gave, but it also took, and the Sebilian learned to walk its margins like ghosts. They fished, they hunted, they scavenged. They left behind clusters of shells, fish bones, animal remains, evidence of both diet and adaptability. They weren't kings, they weren't warriors, but they were something else entirely. Survivors of instability. This was a world unraveling and reforming in real time. The climate was changing, the land was warming, ice sheets retreated, new plants appeared, so did new predators. The Sebilian didn't just react, they adjusted. Their toolkits adapted, their movement patterns evolved. And yet, their absence of hierarchy is equally chilling. No rich graves, no elite houses, no monuments to the dead. This was flat society, egalitarian. If power existed, it didn't advertise. There are no burials with gold or ivory, no signs of central organization. Everyone carried their own weight, or died. There's something unnerving about that, because it means the Sebilian lived in a state of perpetual exposure to the elements, to hunger, to time itself. No gods to beg, no kings to blame, just the flint in your hand and the sun overhead. Civilization had not yet wrapped the world in story. These people lived outside the myth. And yet, unknowingly, they helped write it. Because the Sebilian toolkit, their methods, their lithic logic, laid the groundwork for what would later become the Neolithic shift. Their tools didn't die with them. They were passed on, copied, upgraded. The idea of efficiency, of refinement, of human ingenuity chipping away at chaos that began here. Even their disappearance wasn't violent. They simply dissolved. Slowly. Their flint tools became fewer, their sites less frequent. No sign of invasion, no environmental apocalypse. Just a cultural fade, like a candle burning low, flickering out as newer ways of life crept in people who started planting, staying, naming the land instead of dodging it. But make no mistake, the Sebilian lived through the hard part, the unknown part, before God's promised order, before kings claimed bloodlines, before the Nile was charted and taxed. They were already there. Watching, working, cutting their way through the dark, and then they were gone. Not erased, just overwritten. But what they left behind was not forgotten. Every polished blade, every chipped core, every flint tool buried beneath later tombs is a ghost print. And if you pick one up, turn it in your hand, you'll feel it. Precision, purpose, pressure. And somewhere upstream, time surged forward. The world was about to flood again, not with water, but with language, with cities, with bureaucracy, with divine rule. Because in the east, a new force was stirring, one that wouldn't just cut flint, it would carve gods. They called themselves the Sumerians, and they didn't walk into history. They invented it, Sumerians. If Egypt was born from the Nile, then Mesopotamia was torn from the mud between two warring serpents, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And somewhere in that violent delta, the Sumerians didn't just rise. They materialized, fully formed, like a civilization dropped from the sky. Around 4,500 BCE, they appeared already building, already organizing, already speaking in stone and number and divine terror. While Nile cultures were still crafting burial jars and praying to river rhythms, the Sumerians were building cities. Let's be clear, this wasn't just another riverine community. This was the first civilization as we know it. Sumer didn't flirt with structure, it welded it to the earth. Cities like Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash didn't grow, they exploded. Monumental architecture, gridded streets, irrigation networks, bureaucracy in clay and bone, and at the center of each city, towering like a mountain birthed from logic, the ziggurat. They weren't temples, they were cosmic control towers. The ziggurat wasn't just a religious center, it was a ladder between worlds, earth and sky, man and God. And at the top, unseen but omnipresent, a deity who did not negotiate. The Sumerians didn't ask their gods for things, they appeased them or suffered. And there was a lot of suffering, because Sumer was built not in balance with nature, but in opposition to it. Floods didn't bless, they destroyed. The Tigris could drown a city overnight. The Euphrates could abandon crops to dust. The Sumerians responded not with reverence but with control. They built canals, dikes, reservoirs, drainage systems. They bent rivers like metal. Agriculture wasn't a gift, it was a war. But Sumer won, and in winning, they wrote the first chapter of the world's longest story, urban civilization. They gave us writing cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with the edge of a reed. At first, just numbers, ledgers, ration tallies, who owes whom what and how much. But soon, those strokes became sounds, names, prayers, epic poetry, contracts, divinations, laws. Writing was born not from poetry, but from inventory. They also created the wheel, not just for carts, but for pottery, mass-producing vessels like an ancient industrial complex. They invented plows, sailed boats along artificial canals, brewed beer in vats, cataloged stars. They wrote tax codes and hymnals in the same breath. And all of it came with a catch. Because with complexity comes cost. The Sumerians weren't ruled by tribes. They were ruled by temple complexes, by priest kings, by bureaucrats who calculated devotion. Their society was stratified, rigid. At the top, priests, scribes, and rulers. Below, craftsmen, merchants, laborers, and at the bottom, slaves. Not metaphorical ones. Real, breathing humans captured in war or born into bondage. And war? That was constant. City-states didn't unite. They clashed. Uruk versus Kish versus Lagash. Temples raised armies. Kings recorded battle in stone like recipes. And when one city won, they didn't just loot, they rewrote the gods. Your god didn't lose. He was absorbed, recontextualized, domesticated into the winner's pantheon. Even their mythology reeks of bureaucracy and bitterness. Their creation myths tell of gods overwhelmed by labor who made humans to carry the load. Born not for glory, but for utility. You were made to farm, to serve, to suffer so they didn't have to. And if you stepped out of line, plague, drought, silence. It's terrifying because it feels so familiar. Sumer is where all our ghosts were first born. The office, the tax, the boss, the ledger, the law, the debt, the bureaucratic divine. But also, the story. Because alongside all this control and cruelty, the Sumerians gave us literature. They gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving epic known to man. A story of grief, power, mortality. A king who tries to conquer death and fails. And maybe that's the most honest thing Sumer ever wrote. For all their brilliance, they couldn't outrun entropy. Salinization ruined their soil. Internal conflict weakened their cities. Foreign powers, Akkadians, Gutians, Amorites, swallowed them up. And yet, they were never truly gone, because everything after was Sumerian with upgrades. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, even Egypt took notes on structure, on governance, on divine rulership cloaked in administration. But before the empire, before the state, before the name that lasts forever, there was the first attempt. And when the Sumerians began chiseling history into clay, others further east were watching. Not to mimic, but to mirror. The Ubaid were already here, and their shadows were stretching wide. Ubaid culture. Long before Sumer's clay tablets told tales of gods and kings, before ziggurats clawed into Mesopotamia's dry skies, there was Ubaid, the foundation beneath the foundation. From around 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, the Ubaid culture sprawled silently across the southern Mesopotamian plain, not with monuments or war, but with something much more unsettling. Uniformity. That's what makes Ubaid terrifying. Not their weapons, they had none worth noting. Not their gods, those hadn't been named yet. What they had, what they enforced, was a kind of pre-civilizational order so consistent, so widespread, it almost suggests something beyond simple cooperation. It suggests control. The Ubaid horizon stretches wide from the Persian Gulf to northern Mesopotamia, across hundreds of kilometers of settlements, all eerily similar. Same layout, same house shapes, same types of pottery. Same tools. It's as if the region had been templated, as if someone or something wanted everyone working from the same script. This was the Ubaid signature, the standardization of life. You see it first in their architecture. Ubaid houses weren't random huts. They were T-shaped, mud brick structures with central halls and side rooms, often oriented in identical patterns regardless of where they were built. Rural village, T-shaped, proto-town, still T-shaped. It's like the IKEA starter kit for permanent dwelling. But this repetition wasn't just style, it was ideology made spatial. The same goes for their pottery. Ubaid ceramics weren't flashy. They were muted greenish or brownish clay with dark geometric lines. No grand imagery, no mythic beasts, just patterns, minimal, functional, repeated endlessly across thousands of sites, mass production before mass culture. That's what haunts archaeologists, how uniform it all is. No evidence of kings, no massive temples, no palaces, and yet, the Ubaid elite existed. You find them in burial contexts, bodies interred with finer goods, in better positions, under more elaborate structures. There was hierarchy, but it was quiet, unspoken, woven into the grid instead of shouted from a throne. They controlled irrigation. That much is clear. Southern Mesopotamia isn't forgiving land. Without water management, you die. The Ubaid people carved canals, built dikes, and orchestrated the seasonal flow of the Tigris and Euphrates into predictable abundance. You don't do that without coordination. You don't do that without someone or some group giving orders. But who were they? Priests? Bureaucrats? Ritual engineers? We'll never know. They left no names, no grand declarations, just infrastructure, just systems. Just the chilling realization that civilization's bones were set before its stories began. And those bones were Ubaid. Even their religious life is more eerie than sacred. Ubaid figurines have been found elongated, lizard-like faces, with wide eyes, long limbs, and intricate hats. Some are female. Some are nursing infants. Others hold offerings. Are they gods? Ancestors? Aliens? Theories abound, but one thing is clear. They weren't made for decoration. They weren't mass-produced. They were icons, and they look nothing like later Mesopotamian gods, which means this might be a different pantheon altogether, one erased, one that didn't survive the rise of Sumer or was intentionally buried beneath it. Even their decline is cryptic. Around 3800 BCE, the Ubaid culture doesn't fall, it melts into Uruk, into Sumer. Their settlements evolve, their structures get upgraded, their systems co-opted. The Ubaid people may not have been conquered, they may have just changed masks. But the DNA of their world, the irrigation, the house plans, the social stratification without spectacle, that all survived. Which means we have to ask the terrifying question. Was Ubaid the prototype? Not of a culture, but of civilization itself. Before kings, before myths, before empires screamed their names into eternity, there was the whisper of Ubaid, the low hum of coordination, of policy without pageantry, of control without crowns. And it didn't stay in Mesopotamia. Their influence reached the Persian Gulf, up the Tigris, into Iran, into Syria. Their aesthetic, their systems, their silence, they spread like an operating system, installing itself in cultures yet unborn. And while Sumer may have written history's first lines, it was Ubaid that designed the font. But across the Zagros Mountains, east of Ubaid's disciplined sprawl, something else was stirring. Not a mirror, not a replica, a rival, a civilization that wouldn't standardize, but defy. That wouldn't whisper, but speak in thunder. Elam was coming, and it was watching with eyes full of fire. Elamites. Tucked behind the Zagros Mountains, east of the Tigris, the Elamites waited, watched, with teeth behind their silence. While Sumer was building cities in the plains and carving gods into clay tablets, Elam was brewing an ancient rival not born from imitation, but from its own separate storm. By around 3200 BCE, the Elamites were carving out territory in what is now southwestern Iran, centered around Susa, Anshan, and other city-states nestled in the harsh, jagged terrain. And unlike their southern neighbors, they weren't content to build peacefully in the shadow of Mesopotamia. They built against it. The Elamites weren't just different, they were dissonant. They spoke a language unrelated to anything around them. Sumerian, Akkadian, Semitic? No. Elamite was a linguistic island, a language isolate. It was like finding a signal that doesn't match any frequency, a civilization broadcasting from deep time on its own wavelength. And that's the first terrifying truth about Elam. You can't classify it. It had kings and queens sometimes reigning together. It had temples and gods, but not the orderly pantheon of Sumer. Its religion was a shadow mirror, a pantheon blurred by distance and secrecy. Their chief god wasn't Anu or Enlil. It was Inshushinak, a deity of death, judgment, and the underworld, a being whose temple stood like a throne of shadow over Susa, the Elamite capital. Where Sumer wrote poems of grief and fate, Elam wrote edicts of vengeance. Their kings etched inscriptions in vertical columns rather than horizontal lines, like they wanted to climb their own words instead of reading them. Their art, their dress, their architectural layouts, all of it was uniquely theirs. They weren't a periphery to Sumer's light. They were a black star of their own gravity. Susa, their great city, is a testament to this defiance. It began as a humble settlement in the Ubaid period, but quickly mutated into something else entirely, a power center carved into the slope of empire. At its heart stood a ziggurat, yes, like those in Sumer, but more angular, more severe, built not to mimic, but to challenge. And challenge they did. The Elamites and the Sumerians hated each other in the way only two ancient siblings can. They raided each other, conquered each other, looted, burned, rebuilt, and then did it all again. They weren't always enemies, but when they were, it was biblical. One of the earliest recorded sackings in human history, Elam did that. They marched into Mesopotamia, tore down its walls, and dragged its idols back across the mountains. Sumer would return the favor, of course, but the tone was set. Elam didn't exist to follow. It existed to confront. And while Sumer prized order, Elam thrived in ambiguity. Their political system wasn't always centralized. Power shifted between federated city-states, between religious figures and warrior rulers, sometimes even shared between male and female monarchs. Yes, queens with real power. The most famous? Queen Shilhaha, who ruled alongside her brother husband in what can only be described as a dynasty of divine incest and vengeance. This wasn't just royalty. This was ritual rulership, a fusion of blood, gods, and governance. And like Sumer, Elam used writing but sparingly, ominously. No sweeping literary epics, no detailed economic ledgers, at least not ones we've found. When Elamite kings wrote, it was on monuments of domination, boundary stones, curse tablets, statements of absolute control. One reads simply, "Whoever destroys this inscription, may the gods burn his seed." Elam didn't need nuance. It needed permanence. They minted their influence in bricks and blood, and unlike Sumer, they endured not as a golden age that passed, but as a repeating scar across the history of the region. The Elamites would vanish and reappear, collapse and retaliate for millennia, always returning, always re-emerging from the mountains like a bad prophecy. Even after their cities fell and their gods were forgotten, the fear remained. In Babylonian texts, the name Elam is often followed by terms like dread, curse, blight. They weren't remembered fondly. They were remembered accurately. But Elam wasn't just war and curses. They were a mystery that refused to be decoded. Their language is only partially understood. Their rituals, only glimpsed through ruins. Their people, scattered through time like a rumor no one can quite confirm. They didn't write epics, they became one. And just when you think you've mapped the ancient world, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, you realize Elam was always behind the curtain, watching, waiting, surviving. And while Elam burned its name into the cliffs, far to the east, another civilization stirred, not with iron, not with fire, but with rivers of silence and cities of stone and grid. It was vast, peaceful, impossibly clean. And when it collapsed, it didn't scream. It vanished. The Indus Valley had entered the story, and no one would ever forget it. Indus Valley, yes, per hectare Rappan civilization. At its peak, it was bigger than Egypt, bigger than Mesopotamia, stretching across more than 1.25 million square kilometers of what is now Pakistan, northwest India, and eastern Afghanistan. The Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, was not just large. It was precise. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because this was a civilization that built no pyramids, carved no epic steles of war, left behind no royal tombs full of golden masks. And yet, it built entire cities with a level of planning so advanced, it makes later empires look like children stacking blocks. From around 3,300 BCE to 1,700 BCE, the Harappans engineered a world not of monuments, but of systems. Cities like Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, and Lothal weren't accidents. They were masterworks of civil engineering, laid out on grids, built with standardized bricks, drained by advanced, city-wide sewage networks that, to this day, outperform the plumbing in some modern neighborhoods. While other ancient peoples glorified chaos and tried to bend nature through worship and blood, the Harappans organized it. They measured their bricks to a specific one, 2:4 ratio length, width, height, across thousands of miles. They developed standardized weights and measures. They used drill bits made from diamond-tipped materials to bore holes into beads. They didn't guess. They calculated. They didn't ask their gods for permission. They built without them. Because here's what's really disturbing. We can't find the theocracy. We can't find the ruling class. There are no vast temples, no lavish palaces, no sculptures of kings trampling enemies. What we find instead are hundreds of uniform houses, public baths, granaries, workshops. In Mohenjo-Daro, there's a structure we now call the Great Bath, a meticulously watertight, brick-lined pool with built-in drainage, steps, and water management. It's not for farming. It's not for waste. It's ritual, sure, but what kind of ritual? For whom? By whose order? We don't know. That's the central mystery of the Indus. They had order without visible oppression. They had culture without obvious conquest. They had cities without central monuments to death. That's not just unusual. That's unprecedented. Their script, still undeciphered, is found on thousands of seals and tablets, usually paired with animal motifs and geometric symbols. We don't know what it says. We don't even know if it's language or proto-language, but whatever it was everywhere. The Harappans weren't illiterate. They were illegible. To us, and maybe that was the point. Maybe their world wasn't made to be understood by outsiders. Maybe it wasn't built for legacy. It was built to function. And function it did. The Indus economy ran on a sophisticated web of agriculture, trade, and production. Wheat, barley, cotton, yes, cotton, thousands of years before it was known in other regions were grown and traded. They crafted beads, jewelry, pottery, tools. They exported to Mesopotamia, and possibly beyond. And yet, they left no empires, no emperors, no named kings, no great wars recorded, no self-congratulatory mythos, just silence. When they vanished around 1700 BCE, they didn't go out in fire. They went out in gradients. The cities were slowly abandoned, the bricks repurposed, the order decayed, not through conquest, but through change. Climate shift, river relocation, trade breakdown, famine, plague, all of it maybe. But there was no single cataclysm, no sacking army, just silence. Imagine a city like Mohenjo-Daro, once full of careful commerce, ritual bathing, quiet governance now hollow, dust blowing through grid-planned streets, wells dry, drains clogged, beads unstrung, no final scream, no curtain fall. Just a civilization folding itself into the soil. That's the nightmare. Because it means civilization doesn't need kings to die. It only needs the system to stop working. And when that happens, everything can vanish, even a civilization more advanced than its time without anyone noticing until centuries later. Even now, the Indus Valley keeps its secrets. Its script resists decryption. Its people left no self-portraits, no dynastic lineages, no declarations of power, just bricks, beads, drains. And the eerie feeling that the deeper we dig, the less we understand. But there is one site further upstream, older, quieter, almost like a dream memory of what Harappa became. A place where agriculture began not as strategy, but as ritual. A place that predates the cities and scripts and bathhouses. Its name was Mehrgarh, and in its bones, the first roots of civilization stir. Mehrgarh culture. Before cities stood in stone, before writing carved law into clay, before gods wore crowns and demanded offerings, there was Mehrgarh, a place where humans first dared to shape time. Nestled on the ancient Kachi plain of present-day Pakistan, Mehrgarh bloomed around 7000 BCE like a whisper on the edge of the Neolithic world. It didn't rise with war. It didn't expand with conquest. It grew slow, steady, and terrifyingly sophisticated. Because this wasn't just another early farming village. Mehrgarh was a laboratory of civilization. A place where humanity took its first trembling steps toward domestication, not just of plants and animals, but of itself. The people here did something few had tried before. They stayed. They built mud brick houses, grew barley and wheat, domesticated sheep, goats, zebu cattle, and they didn't just gather wild food, they cultivated it, season after season, trusting that the earth would remember. That's the horror of Mehrgarh, the gamble. Farming isn't safe. It's not natural. It's a defiance, a human imposition on a world that doesn't care if you live or die. But they did it anyway. And not just for food, but for ritual. One of the oldest signs of deliberate burial in South Asia comes from Mehrgarh. Not haphazard, not shallow. Carefully laid out graves, bodies positioned, grave goods included. A mother buried with her infant. A man buried with tools and beads. Some had ornaments, others didn't. Even this early, the dead were catalogued. And so were the living. Mehrgarh's population was one of the first to show clear divisions of labor. The archaeological record bursts with specialized tools: flint blades, microliths, bone awls, bead drills, grinding stones. Artisans weren't a caste, they were a necessity. You don't get thousands of uniformly shaped beads without someone spending their entire life making beads. That's not survival. That's culture. And as Mehrgarh evolved, so did its materials. Early phases show local goods, handmade pottery, simple tools. But over time, you start to see trade: turquoise, lapis lazuli, seashells from hundreds of miles away. The people of Mehrgarh didn't just work the land, they reached out. Their network extended beyond rivers and deserts, toward what would later become Baluchistan, the Iranian plateau, even the distant Gulf. They were part of something older than any map, a web of exchange before the wheel turned. And yet, for all their refinement, their architecture stayed humble. No monumental buildings, no elite compounds, no temples, just clusters of rooms, storage pits, courtyards organized but equal. Society here wasn't a pyramid, it was a grid, at least in the beginning. Because then, the burials began to shift. Later, graves show more wealth, more ornamentation. Some individuals were buried with dozens of beads, others with none. Children with lavish goods implying inherited status. The soft creep of hierarchy had begun, and with it came medicine. Yes, Mehrgarh is home to some of the earliest known dental surgeries in human history. Drilled molars, ancient teeth showing signs of controlled, intentional boring, possibly to relieve infection or remove decay. It wasn't crude, it was practiced. Someone learned how to cut into a tooth without killing the patient. That means pain was understood, managed, manipulated. These weren't just early farmers. These were early scientists. And yet, as with all things born too early, Mehrgarh began to fade. By around 2500 BCE, the site declined. Was it absorbed into the Indus Valley civilization? Was it abandoned due to shifting trade, climate collapse, disease? The evidence grows thin. The structures decay. The beads stop being made. The graves go unfilled. But what remained was the template. When Harappa rose, it inherited Mehrgarh's bones. Its agricultural systems, its bead-making techniques, its layout logic. Even its dental knowledge shows up later, suggesting that Mehrgarh didn't vanish. It was reborn, as a civilization that spanned an empire of cleanliness and silence. But before that silence, before that grid, there was mud and fire and human will churning in the dust of the Kachi plain. Mehrgarh isn't famous. It doesn't make it into most world history textbooks, but it should. Because it's not just one of the oldest Neolithic sites in South Asia. It's the blueprint, the place where people first stopped running, where they planted grain and watched it grow, where they buried their dead with care, where they cracked open a molar and tried to heal what hurt, where they made choices, not to worship, not to conquer, but to begin. And far, far away on another continent, beyond jungles and deserts, another people were doing something equally radical, building something not in clay or brick, but in stone and sound. They didn't leave behind writing. They left behind geometry. And their name was Caral-Supe. Caral-Supe civilization. Somewhere in the dry valleys of coastal Peru, 5,000 years ago, a people rose without noise. No wars, no palaces, no statues of brutal kings, just stone, wind, and order. This was the Caral-Supe civilization, and it shouldn't exist. By 3500 BCE, while Sumer was still wrestling with clay tablets and Egypt had yet to lift a single pyramid stone, Caral had already mapped out a city, not a village, not a farming cluster, a city, one of the oldest in the world. Caral was built in the Supe Valley, surrounded by arid, lifeless desert, just miles from the Pacific coast. It had no rivers like the Nile, no floodplains like Mesopotamia, no seasonal monsoon like the Indus. Yet it sustained urban life, centralized planning, and monumental architecture. That's the first horror. They did it without the usual tools of civilization. There's no evidence of warfare, no weapons, no fortifications, no mass graves, no artwork glorifying conquest or death. And yet, they built platform mounds, sunken plazas, complex canal systems, residential zones, and ritual spaces on a scale that rivals anything in pre-dynastic Egypt. Their largest pyramid-like mound, built centuries before Egypt's first pyramid, stood over 60 feet tall and required hundreds of thousands of tons of stone. Not built by slaves, not demanded by divine tyrants, but seemingly organized through something else entirely. What that something was, we still don't know. That's the second horror. We can't hear them. They left no writing, no decipherable script, just knotted chords, known as quipus, the same system used millennia later by the Inca, a method of recording numbers, data, possibly even narratives. But without a Rosetta Stone, their voices remain coiled in silence. And yet, somehow, they managed administration, coordination, government. The people of Caral constructed amphitheaters, massive, circular gathering spaces with acoustics engineered so a single voice could carry to hundreds. They built ventilated rooms for ritual fires. They aligned buildings to celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, star risings. Astronomy wasn't a luxury, it was architecture. This wasn't guesswork. This was math. And unlike other early civilizations, Caral didn't seem obsessed with the afterlife. There are no elaborate tombs, no grave goods, no mummified kings. The dead were buried simply, sometimes with cotton shrouds, sometimes with tools or flutes, but never with declarations of power. Which raises a question. Where was the authority? We don't see signs of kingship, no crowned rulers or divine patriarchs, no propaganda carved into stone. And yet, the whole society functioned like a symphony agriculture in the valleys, fishing along the coast, trade routes spanning highlands and jungles, resources flowing in and out with precision. Cotton grown inland was traded for anchovies from the coast. The fish weren't just eaten, they were converted into fertilizer, used to push agriculture even deeper into the desert. Caral grew beans, squash, guava, corn, peppers, sweet potatoes. They irrigated dry land with canal systems and cultivated balance. They didn't conquer, they collaborated. But make no mistake, this wasn't a utopia. Caral may not have had warriors, but it had elites. The layout of the city shows clear social zoning, elevated mounds for some, flat spaces for others, private residences with special access. Public spaces controlled by ceremonial platforms. The elite may not have ruled through violence, but they ruled through ritual, through knowledge, through organization. And as always, the cracks began to show. Environmental evidence suggests periods of drought, earthquakes, social tension. Around 1800 BCE, the civilization began to collapse. People left. Construction halted. The mounds were abandoned. The sunken plazas filled with sand. But they didn't vanish without a trace. The blueprint they left behind: a city without war, a society without writing, a culture without conquest, survived in fragments across Andean prehistory. Later societies, including the Chavin and Inca, would inherit echoes of Caral, its trade networks, its astronomical precision, its deep respect for balance. But Caral-Supe itself? It faded, like a whisper across a stone plaza. And that's the final horror. It worked. For over 1,000 years, a civilization without armies, without monarchs, without blood gods or bronze weapons worked, until it didn't, and no one knows why. It forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about civilization. Maybe you don't need warlords and writing to build a society. Maybe the most radical experiment is peace at scale. Or maybe peace is only temporary. Because across the ocean, far from the soft rhythms of the Andes, a very different society was beginning to rise, one that traded balance for beauty, trade for thalassocracy, peace for labyrinth. The Minoans were coming, and they brought with them the first whispers of secrets beneath the sea. Minoans. Some civilizations are built to endure, others are built to impress. The Minoans, rising from the depths of the Aegean Sea around 2000 BCE, were built to dazzle. And behind the vibrant frescoes, the leaping bulls, and the terraced palaces, they hid something truly terrifying. A secret that no one ever fully cracked. The Minoans weren't the oldest civilization in the world. They didn't invent agriculture or writing or the wheel, but they were the first in Europe to wrap those tools in grace, to make civilization beautiful. And in doing so, they created a culture so elegant, so seemingly peaceful, that it still messes with historians' heads. Because it shouldn't have worked. And yet it did. Centered on the island of Crete, the Minoans emerged seemingly out of nowhere. They built palaces, not single buildings, but sprawling complexes like Knossos, Phaistos, Mallia, and Zakros. These weren't military strongholds. They had no defensive walls, no moats, no watchtowers. And yet, somehow, they were safe. For centuries. Knossos alone sprawled over 6 acres, a labyrinth of rooms, halls, workshops, staircases, and shrines. It housed thousands. It processed goods from all over the Mediterranean. And it did it with a kind of aesthetic arrogance that was centuries ahead of its time. Frescoes painted in wet plaster, true fresco depicting dolphins, lilies, dancers, and above all, bulls. The bull dominated Minoan culture, bulls charging, bulls being leapt over in ceremonial acrobatics, horns carved into altars. The horns of consecration symbol, appearing on pottery, architecture, everywhere. What the bull meant is still debated, but one thing is certain. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a god, or a doorway to one. Which brings us to the myths. Because this is where archaeology and nightmare begin to overlap. Crete is the land of Minos, legendary king, the land of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull creature hidden in a labyrinth, of Daedalus, the genius inventor, of Icarus, the boy who flew too high. These aren't just stories, they're echoes, fractured memories of something real, something forgotten. Because the palaces do feel like labyrinths, intentionally disorienting, winding, layered, with no clear central axis, no throne room at the heart, just movement, pathways, mazes of ritual. And the Minotaur? Some believe it was a distorted memory of the bull-leaping rituals, the elite's coming-of-age test, launching oneself over the horns of a charging beast. That's not religion. That's initiation by trauma. The Minoans didn't build cities the way others did. They didn't dominate their neighbors. They didn't write conquest epics. They didn't even depict war at all in their art. And that's where the real horror seeps in. Because it means something else held the power. What kind of society can build palaces without walls, ritual without armies, cities without enemies? Answer: one where the enemy is inside. We don't know who ruled. There are no clear depictions of kings or queens, no royal iconography like in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Some believe women may have held religious and political power. The snake goddess statues suggest a matriarchal priesthood, half mother, half enigma. Others believe the power was hidden in the priesthood, in rituals lost to time, in rites of passage that never got written down, because while the Minoans had writing, we still can't read it. Their script, Linear A, remains undeciphered. We have hundreds of tablets, inventories, offerings, lists of something. But without a Rosetta Stone, Linear A is still a locked door. And maybe it's better that way, because when the Minoans fell, they didn't go quietly. Around 1450 BCE, most Minoan palaces burned simultaneously. Except for Knossos. Knossos survived longer but under new management. Mycenaeans. Warlike, hierarchical, Greek-speaking. They took over, and within a century, the Minoans were a memory. Their palaces empty, their gods forgotten, their language vanished. And the cause? No one agrees. Some blame Thera, a volcanic eruption so massive it may have triggered a tsunami, famine, collapse. Others blame internal unrest, or invasion, or slow decay. Maybe it was all of them, maybe none. What's left behind is a civilization of mirrors and masks, a society that built without fortification, worshipped without violence, and collapsed without a final scream. And beneath it all, the lingering fear. What did they know that we don't? Because while their palaces burned, their myths survived. In Athens, in Rome, in our nightmares, a maze, a monster, a forgotten name. And further north, beyond the mountains and rivers of Mesopotamia, another culture was rising, not graceful, but grounded, not mythic, but methodical. The Halaf were coming, and they brought with them the first language of clay and symmetry, Halaf culture. Long before cuneiform, long before the towering ziggurats of Ur or the militarized city-states of Akkad, there was a people in northern Mesopotamia who quietly mastered the art of balance. The Halaf culture, flourishing around 6,100 to 5,100 BCE, didn't scream itself into history. It painted its way in. With geometry, with clay, with a terrifying level of precision. Centered in what is now northern Iraq, northeastern Syria, and southeastern Turkey, the Halaf weren't an empire. They weren't kings or warriors. They left no conquest epics or statues of gods crushing enemies. They left bowls, thousands of them, painted with spirals, grids, eyes, calm-toothed zigzags, dots, and diamonds. Ceramics so symmetrical, so obsessively detailed, they feel like something from a 3D printer, not a prehistoric kiln. This is the first terror of the Halaf. They used aesthetic as control. They lived before metallurgy, before states, before most cities, and yet they created pottery so refined, so standardized, that archaeologists can trace their movement by style alone. Their bowls traveled farther than most kings of the era. Wherever Halaf people settled, they brought their motifs and a mindset of order above all. But this wasn't just art. It was identity. Because Halaf ceramics weren't just for storage, many were found in burials, placed with the dead, offered in ritual. Some even seemed too fragile for daily use. They weren't made for practicality. They were made for meaning. And meaning, in Halaf culture, lived in the symmetry. The repetition, the visual language of balance. It wasn't just beautiful, it was symbolic. These weren't abstract doodles. They were code, cultural encryption in ceramic form. We don't know what the symbols meant, but we know they mattered. And they didn't just make pottery. They built architecture, circular houses called tholoi, with domed roofs and stone foundations. Not massive, not fortified, but consistent. The same structures across vast regions. Again, standardization without centralization. The Halaf had no known capital, no ruler, no army, but they had uniformity. How? Trade, mobility, ritual cohesion, some system linked these scattered settlements into a network rather than a nation. They weren't just sharing goods. They were sharing culture at scale, centuries before states emerged to force it. That's the second terror of the Halaf. They created civil cohesion without conquest. We're trained to think of civilization as something built on domination, pharaohs, emperors, conquests. But the Halaf prove that you don't need war to unify people. You can do it with style, with repetition, with bowls. And yet, this precision had its price. Burials suggest growing inequality. Early on, most graves are simple, unadorned, communal, but over time, a pattern emerges. Some graves contain finer goods, ceramics, beads, tools, while others are left bare. A soft stratification, a creeping verticality. The social pyramid was sketching itself. Children are buried with grave goods. Inheritance, status passed down. A child, not yet old enough to make anything, owns objects that took hours, days, lives to craft. That means society was tilting. The system was getting heavier. And then there's the figurines. Small, often female, stylized, exaggerated hips, prominent breasts, not realistic, symbolic. Were they goddesses, fertility idols, ancestral spirits? We don't know. But they were everywhere, placed in homes, buried in pits, sometimes decapitated intentionally, some found with smashed heads, broken limbs, ritual damage, symbolic murder. It wasn't random, it was performed. That's the third horror. The Halaf had ritual, but it wasn't gentle. Even without temples, they created a spiritual economy. Objects made to be destroyed, ceramics painted only to be buried, labor poured into form, only to be discarded with meaning. It's art made not for eternity, but for oblivion. And eventually, the Halaf themselves followed the same path. By 5100 BCE, their culture faded, replaced by the Ubaid, another standardizing force, but colder, more infrastructural. Where Halaf had painted symbols, Ubaid made drains. Where Halaf encoded culture in spirals, Ubaid embedded it in house plans and irrigation ditches. The Halaf didn't fall. They were absorbed. Their motifs disappear, their symmetry erased, their message buried like their bowls in whole pieces, cracked by time, dismissed by empire. But their legacy? It lingers in every pattern. In every symbol we don't understand, in every time someone made something beautiful without knowing why and sacrificed it to the earth. The Halaf were the civilization that whispered the blueprint for culture through geometry. And beyond the hills where they painted their code in clay, another people were gathering not to trade, not to symbolize, but to wield. They weren't artists. They were hammers. The Hittites were coming. And they brought with them a new language. The language of iron, Hittites. Some civilizations ascend through invention, others through art. The Hittites, they rose through sheer, calculated, blunt force. If the Halaf were geometry and the Minoans were elegance, the Hittites were a hammer, cold, silent, and smashing every soft, delicate thing that stood in their way. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, The Hittites were already clawing their way through the rocky plateaus of Anatolia, building a kingdom in a place no sane civilization should have bothered with. Mountainous terrain, thin soil, brutal winters, inhospitable highlands. And yet, the Hittites didn't just survive there. They weaponized it. Their capital, Hattusa, wasn't a cradle of abundance like the Nile or the Euphrates. It was a fortress, built into cliffs, walled by cyclopean stones, guarded by lion gates and hidden passageways. Not beautiful, not symmetrical, but effective. Hattusa didn't welcome you, it dared you. The Hittites were masters of siege architecture, gate design, city-level defense planning. Everything about their urban layout says, you won't get in, and if you do, you won't leave alive. And inside that fortified spine of a city lived something even more terrifying, a bureaucracy sharpened like a blade. The Hittites were obsessed with records. They didn't just rule through sword and fire, they ruled through archives. Thousands of clay tablets in cuneiform script, written in a strange Indo-European language, a linguistic outlier among the Semitic and Sumerian scripts of the ancient Near East. Their language wasn't native to the region. It came from somewhere else. They came from somewhere else. Migrants, invaders, survivors from an older migration wave? No one's entirely sure. What we do know is this: the Hittites were not original to the land they ruled. And yet, they made it theirs. They were cultural cannibals. They borrowed the script of the Akkadians, adopted the deities of the Hurrians. They took Sumerian myths, renamed the characters, changed the endings. They rewrote everything they touched. Their pantheon? Colossal. Hundreds of gods, storm gods, sun goddesses, earth mothers, mountain spirits, so many that they had a nickname for it, the 1,000 gods of Hatti. But their chief deity was always the storm god, a fitting icon for a people who carved their kingdom from thunder. And thunder followed them wherever they went. Because the Hittites weren't just an empire, they were a military innovation engine. They refined the chariot into a machine of precision. While others used slow, cumbersome carts, the Hittites built lighter, faster, deadlier models, perfect for hurling javelins or spears and disappearing before retaliation. They fielded armies of disciplined, logistically supported troops. They mastered siege warfare. Their generals kept war diaries. Their kings struck contracts of peace and, more importantly, contracts of war. One of the oldest surviving peace treaties in history, the Treaty of Kadesh, a document carved in both Hittite and Egyptian script declaring mutual respect between the Hittite king Hattusili III and Pharaoh Ramesses II after the most famous chariot battle the world has ever seen. It didn't stop the bloodshed, but it showed something else. The Hittites were playing the long game. They didn't burn their enemies. They filed them, and this legal obsession extended to their own people. Hittite law wasn't just punitive, it was detailed. Pages of statutes covering land rights, livestock disputes, bride prices, assault, adultery, sorcery, property theft, and even penalties for biting off another man's nose. Yes, that's real. They weren't lawless warlords. They were a state, modern in its complexity, terrifying in its granularity. But all this control had a cost. Because the Hittite Empire, like the chariot they mastered, moved fast and it crashed hard. By the 12th century BCE, everything began to fracture. Climate disruption, drought, famine, invasion from the mysterious sea peoples. The Hittites, masters of the highlands, authors of order, makers of war, vanished so completely that when Greek scholars found the ruins of Hattusa, they had no idea what they were looking at. The Hittites had been erased, but not entirely. Their language survived in whispers. Their legal codes echoed in the systems of later empires. Their city walls stood long after the names of their kings were forgotten. Their treaties became the blueprints for diplomacy, and beneath their shattered stones, a darker memory lingered. Because to their south, another people had been watching them all along. A people who buried their dead under tumuli, painted their gods in black, and carved their power from the floodplains of Nubia. The Kerma culture was rising, and it didn't borrow from Egypt. It rivaled it. Kerma culture. South of Egypt, where the Nile snakes through the blistered sands of Nubia, something unexpected was rising. A civilization not built in Egypt's shadow but in its face. The Kerma culture, flourishing between 2500 and 1500 BCE, wasn't a satellite. It wasn't a borrowed kingdom. It was a rival throne, forged in heat, warfare, and blood-soaked prestige. The Egyptians called the region Ta-Seti, land of the bow, and feared it, not because it was wild, but because it was organized. Kerma wasn't a nomadic cluster. It was a state. A structured, ambitious, terrifyingly independent civilization, one that grew teeth while Egypt was still cutting its own. Its capital, also called Kerma, rose like a mirage on the floodplain. But it wasn't illusion. It was real. With defensive walls, public buildings, temples, and a burial complex so massive it made some of Egypt's royal tombs look modest. This wasn't just survival in the desert. This was sovereignty. Kerma's elite were called kings, but they weren't just figureheads. They commanded armies, controlled trade routes, held political power that extended deep into the southern Nile and up toward Egypt's throat. Their city had workshops, admin buildings, and at its heart, a structure known as the Western Defufa. Made from mud brick, 3 stories tall, windowless, monolithic. It looked like a ziggurat stripped of its metaphors, not ornamental, not subtle. It was dominion in brick. Archaeologists still debate its function: temple, palace, both, but whatever it wasn't passive. Kerma didn't just exist alongside Egypt, it clashed with it. Repeatedly. There are records of Nubian forces pushing into Upper Egypt, raising border forts, seizing goods. In Egypt's Middle Kingdom, pharaohs launched campaigns deep into Nubia, partly to plunder, partly to neutralize what they knew was a growing threat. Kerma wasn't interested in being civilized by its neighbors. It was interested in competing. And its power wasn't just military. It was cultural. Kerma developed its own aesthetic, a dark, burnished pottery so finely made it was once misattributed to Egypt. Red on the outside, black on the inside, burnished to a reflective gleam. These weren't just functional vessels. They were ritualistic, deliberate, ceremonial. Their artisans crafted intricate jewelry, animal-shaped amulets, polished stone figures. They worked gold, ivory, and bronze. They carved funerary stelae. They designed burial landscapes, with tumuli up to 300 feet in diameter, ringed with sacrificial bodies. Yes, human sacrifice. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individuals buried alongside a king or elite figure, bodies laid in careful patterns, some curled in fetal position, others beheaded, some clearly servants, others possibly high-ranking companions. A dark, deliberate social theology of servitude extending beyond death. And here's what makes it worse. It wasn't chaos. It was choreographed. This wasn't a society crumbling under superstition. It was a society wielding ritual like legislation. Every sacrifice was a message. The king does not die alone. His status does not end. His control does not lapse. Power, in Kerma, was eternal and terrifyingly tangible. But the relationship with Egypt wasn't just war. There was also trade: gold, cattle, incense, ebony, ivory, leopard skins. Kerma was a conduit of luxury, a supplier of prestige to the Egyptian elite. They traded as equals when it suited them, fought when it didn't. For centuries, this dynamic flipped back and forth, sometimes hostile, sometimes transactional, never submissive. And then, around 1500 BCE, it ended. Egypt, under the 18th dynasty, pushed deep into Nubia with force. Thutmose I launched a full-scale campaign, annexed the territory, burned Kerma, and turned Nubia into a colony. The city fell. The kings died. The tomb stopped. Kerma was buried, but not erased. Because its descendants didn't forget, they retreated, reorganized, and centuries later, they returned this time as the Kingdom of Kush. And in an act of poetic vengeance, they would one day conquer Egypt, crown their own pharaohs, rule from Thebes. But that's another story. Kerma itself left behind bones, shadows, and a warning. Don't assume that civilization flows north to south, or that greatness wears a white crown. Sometimes it wears charcoal black pottery and buries its dead with rows of the living. And while Egypt claimed it had defeated its southern foe, its own myths tell another story. A stranger from the desert, a challenger with dark skin and sacred animals, a sorcerer king with rituals older than Osiris. Kerma may have died in fire, but its echo lingered. And in that echo, myth began to twist. Because not all civilizations are real. Some are remembered wrong or invented entirely. The next was one such place, not carved into stone or mud brick, but conjured. Atlantis and the lies we tell about it. Atlantis? Let's get this out of the way first. Atlantis never existed. There are no ruins, no maps, no inscriptions, no shards of pottery dredged from a forgotten seabed, no bones buried beneath coral. Atlantis is a ghost story born in Plato's mind, around 360 BCE, told secondhand through dialogues and parables and philosophical theater. And yet, few myths have dug their claws deeper into human imagination. Few names have echoed louder across conspiracy theory, pseudoscience, and speculative archaeology. Atlantis isn't just a myth, it's a mirror, one that reflects our deepest cultural obsessions, with collapse, with power, with punishment, and most terrifying of all, with the idea that the perfect civilization already happened and we lost it, because that's what Plato said. In his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis is described as a great island, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar, a naval power, blessed by gods, fabulously wealthy, ruled by kings descended from Poseidon, a place of concentric canals, gleaming walls, gold-lined temples, and lush plains so fertile they practically birthed grain from the air. A society of perfect symmetry, of order, of abundance. And then, it fell. Not through war, not through plague, but through hubris. According to Plato, the Atlanteans became corrupt, greedy, violent. The gods turned against them. And in a single day and night, the entire island was swallowed by the sea. Gone. Atlantis wasn't just a tale. It was a warning, a parable. Plato wasn't trying to teach history. He was trying to teach morality, using Atlantis as the ultimate what-if scenario. A cautionary tale cloaked in grandeur. And that's where it gets dangerous. Because while Plato meant it as fiction, people wanted it to be real. They still do. The idea of Atlantis taps into something primal. The belief that there once existed a perfect society, technologically advanced, spiritually enlightened, aesthetically flawless, and that its secrets were buried, hidden, stolen from us. We were robbed of utopia, of knowledge, of destiny. That narrative is irresistible. And over the centuries, it metastasized. In the Renaissance, Atlantis became a cipher for lost wisdom. In the 19th century, it was hijacked by occultists and race theorists. In the 20th, it became a bedrock for pseudo-archaeology and esoteric cults. Even Nazis sent expeditions to Tibet and the Andes, looking for signs of the original Aryan Atlantis. It spiraled from metaphor to madness. But let's rewind. Why does Atlantis feel so real? Because it wears the skin of civilization. Plato didn't describe wild myths or monsters. He described infrastructure, irrigation canals, taxation systems, temples, port cities, navy fleets. He spoke of metallurgy, law, agriculture. He described Atlantis in the language of logistics. That's what makes it chilling. It wasn't magic, it was plausible. Too plausible? Atlantis has been found 100 times. In the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in the Azores, in Santorini, in the Sahara. Every year, someone releases a new discovery video, a new decoded map, a new ancient anomaly pinned to Atlantis. And every year, archaeologists sigh. Because Atlantis is the perfect lie. You can never disprove it. It left no trace? That's because the ocean took it. It doesn't match real cultures? That's because it was more advanced than all of them. Every detail that makes it historically impossible just makes it more seductive to those who believe. And the most terrifying part? It undermines real history. Atlantis distracts us from the actual ancient civilizations that rose, fell, and died screaming. Cultures that built the first cities, that carved gods from stone, that mapped the stars without telescopes, that organized labor, religion, warfare, justice, without help from some lost utopia. The myth of Atlantis makes us forget the Tasians, the Halaf, the Indus, the Kerma. Real people, real genius, real suffering. Atlantis? It was never a civilization. It was a projection of everything we want to believe about the past and fear about the future. That somewhere, once, there was perfection. That we had it, that we lost it, and that we can get it back. But what if we can't? What if that idea of a civilization that balanced abundance, technology, peace, and power isn't something we lost? What if it's something we never had? And yet, even Atlantis has its echoes. Cultural descendants, pseudo-histories wrapped in ritual and ruin. The next one doesn't pretend to be myth. It pretends to be science. Fueled by ideologues, occultists, and Nazi mystics, it was the frozen cradle of civilization. They called it Hyperborea, and they believed they were its children. Hyperborea, the Anunnurbi's myth of the frozen north. If Atlantis was the lost paradise of philosophers, Hyperborea was the stolen Eden of ideologues. A continent not of stone or sand, but of ice, blood, and delusion, where truth was rewritten with shovels, rifles, and compasses pointing not just north, but backward through time. To understand Hyperborea, you don't start with archaeology. You start with obsession. Specifically, the obsession of the Anunnurbe, the Nazi SS's archaeological think tank, founded in 1935 under the watchful, frothing eye of Heinrich Himmler. Its mission? To uncover the true origins of the Aryan race, to dig beneath history and find the ancient supremacy that the Nazis believed had been buried by time, lies, and degenerate science. At the heart of this madness was Hyperborea, a mythical northern homeland, older than Babylon, older than Egypt, older than memory, a frozen utopia where a race of superhumans, blonde-haired, light-eyed, taller than modern men, first walked the earth. They were pure, wise, cold-blooded, like glaciers and gods. And according to Nazi mythology, they were the primordial Aryans. It wasn't just fantasy, it was policy. The Anunnurbe didn't just dream of Hyperborea, they searched for it. In the 1932nd and 42nd, SS expeditions were launched to Iceland, Finland, Tibet, even the Arctic, all in pursuit of ancestral truth frozen in ice. Nazi scientists measured skulls, mapped cave systems, translated Vedic scriptures, and hunted down folktales like they were battle maps. It sounds absurd, but they believed it with religious intensity. Because for them, history wasn't a record. It was a weapon. They needed to prove that civilization didn't come from the Middle East, or Africa, or Asia, but from the North. That every major invention, philosophy, and power structure was originally Aryan, corrupted only when these Hyperborean god people descended from the ice and mixed with lesser populations. It wasn't just bad history. It was fabricated prehistory, used to justify genocide. They called Hyperborea the original motherland. A place where time stood still, where technology and spirit were one, where ancient aircraft, yes, aircraft cut through the polar skies, powered by unknown energies, where the black sun shone underground, where the swastika was not a symbol of hate, but a remnant of celestial geometry. This wasn't archaeology. It was mythopoetic nationalism, wrapped in pseudo-academia and dipped in esotericism. But where did the idea come from? Long before the Nazis, Hyperborea was a Greek myth. A land beyond Boreas, the north wind, a place of eternal spring, blessed with sunlight, unaging people, and divine music. Even the gods, the Greeks said, vacationed there. It was beautiful, untouchable, and totally allegorical. But in the 19th century, as racial science and Indo-European linguistic theory metastasized, writers began taking Hyperborea literally. They grafted it onto ancient Aryan migration theories. They mapped it over the Arctic, or Siberia, or Northern Europe. Suddenly, it wasn't just a metaphor, it was a place, a source. And the Anunnaki took that seed and made it monstrous. They turned Hyperborea into a theological engine for their Reich, a place of origin and destiny, a justification for invasion, because if your ancestors owned the world, you were just taking it back. Even after the fall of Nazi Germany, the Hyperborean myth lived on. It bled into post-war conspiracy theory, into underground occultism, into New Age woo. People claimed survivors of Hyperborea had retreated into underground cities, into hollow earth theories, into Antarctica, into fifth-dimensional realms where they were still watching, still guiding, still waiting. It shows up in theosophy, in cosmic ancestry theories, in far-right nationalist movements wrapped in Nordic rune symbology. The ghost of Hyperborea keeps walking. And that's the most terrifying part. Because Hyperborea never left archaeology. It corrupted it, turned it into propaganda, into myth dressed as science, into something that smiles while it rewrites bones. But if there was ever a real Hyperborea, if there was ever a group of ancient people scraping survival out of the tundra, mapping stars, building in the snow, we'll never find them. Because the myth ate the truth. And as history became hallucination, real civilizations were forgotten, overwritten, dismissed. People who lived in deserts and river deltas and stone quarries before gods were named. But what if one of those early cultures designed the Nile itself? Not followed it, not feared it, engineered it. Our next story dives into the Nile Shaper Enclave. A speculative society whispered about in the scars left behind by ancient flood patterns, a civilization that didn't worship the river. They rewrote it, the Nile Shaper Enclave. Before temples kissed the sky and kings were embalmed in gold, before the Nile was sacred, named, or feared, there were people who didn't just live by the river, they reshaped it, or so the theory goes. A speculative civilization. An enclave buried not under sand, but under assumption. We call them the Nile Shapers. And they weren't worshippers. They were engineers. This isn't a culture you'll find in textbooks. No museum plaques, no formal excavation sites. The Nile Shaper Enclave is a hypothetical construct, an archaeological ghost pieced together from hydrological anomalies, geological scars, and ritual absences that shouldn't exist. But if it was real, and it might have been, then it would be one of the oldest examples of hydrological manipulation in human history. Not in the time of the pharaohs, not even in the days of Naqada, much earlier. We're talking pre-dynastic, possibly pre-Bedarian, somewhere between 6,000 and 4,500 BCE. So what's the evidence? Start with the Nile itself. It doesn't flow like a typical river. Its course bends, twists, and doubles back in ways that suggest not just erosion or tectonics, but intervention. Certain regions show signs of having once been dammed, not with modern concrete, but with earth berms, stone layering, and redirected tributaries. Nothing permanent, nothing flashy. Just enough to control seasonal flooding in specific, localized zones. Modern flood modeling sometimes picks up these patterns regions that would have been perfect for agriculture if they had received water diverted from a nearby wadi, and in those places, you find nothing. No cities, no ruins, but sometimes shards. Pottery without context, stone tools in clusters, microliths in shapes that don't match nearby typologies, bits of obsidian that shouldn't be there, layers of silt too thin for natural deposition. That's the first strange thing. Infrastructure without settlement. As if someone had moved the river, planted crops, harvested them, and left without leaving their name. The idea of the Nile Shaper Enclave suggests a group not concerned with territory or ritual or even permanence. They weren't building a city. They were building a machine, a biomechanical collaboration with the river itself, a living infrastructure. Their goal wasn't to dominate the land. It was to make the land respond. Some theorists believe they were nomadic engineers, proto-agricultural groups who returned seasonally to maintain channels, clear out blockages, reinforce berms. Their homes were temporary. Their marks on the land were deliberate. They didn't worship the river as a god. They treated it like a system. And in that sense, they weren't a civilization. They were a protocol. Others suggest a more chilling possibility, that they were eliminated, that their techniques were copied by later Nile cultures, but their identity was wiped deliberately. Because the Nile Shapers had too much power, and power without priesthood is dangerous. Some point to ancient myths, the god Hapi, the personification of the Nile, always depicted as dual-gendered, never quite divine, more elemental. In temple art, Hapi doesn't fight, rule, or judge. He pours water, carries grain, weighs the harvest. A servant god. Or perhaps a memory of a people who once made the river serve. Then there's the odd alignments. In some pre-dynastic sites, irrigation ditches seem to predate the surrounding settlements, like the land was prepared before people arrived, like someone had already planned for others to live there. It raises an uncomfortable thought, that later Egyptian civilization didn't emerge organically from nature, but was built atop a hidden operating system, one designed by people who never wanted to be remembered, or who were remembered as gods, or demons. Even the name Nile Shaper Enclave is modern coined by a fringe group of geoarchaeologists and speculative historians in the late 20th century. But what gives it weight isn't faith. It's the patterns. Too many perfectly placed flood channels, too many unnatural curves, too many silenced gaps. This civilization, if it existed, didn't leave behind language, but it left behind geometry, altered topography, echoes in the river's rhythm. And in that silence, you hear something far older than kingship or conquest. You hear calculation, and then nothing. Because the Nile eventually overwhelmed them, maybe a flood they couldn't stop, maybe ecological collapse. Or maybe they were absorbed, folded into the cultures that came after, their knowledge twisted into religious myth. The river they once engineered became a god. And the engineers? Forgotten. But their ghost remains. In every precise irrigation ditch dug centuries before its time, in every temple that aligns not with the stars, but with the flow of water. And beyond them, beyond the realm of hydraulics and ritual, waited others. Not planners, not farmers, but dealers of obsidian. Across deserts, through volcanic scars, an invisible hand moved glass sharper than steel, and it belonged to the Obsidian Traders. The Obsidian Traders. They left no empire, no city walls, no monuments to lost gods. What they left was sharper glass, black as void, shaped like teeth, scattered across deserts where no one should have walked. The Obsidian Traders were not kings or builders. They were something older. Smugglers of molten stone. This is a speculative culture, like shadows on the walls of real archaeology. You won't find them in museum dioramas. You'll find them in data points. In obsidian flakes dug up thousands of miles from the volcanoes that birthed them. From Ethiopia to the Levant, the Sahara to Upper Egypt, obsidian shows up like breadcrumbs in a conspiracy. And not just any obsidian. Obsidian from specific sources, volcanoes with unique geochemical signatures. Every obsidian blade can be traced like DNA. And what the science tells us is chilling. Pieces of the same volcanic glass show up across vast, unconnected regions, transported long before trade caravans, before chariots, before history. So who moved them? Who carried that glass? Some call them the Obsidian Traders, a speculative network of prehistoric exchange stretching back to the 9th millennium BCE, maybe earlier. Not a culture in the conventional sense. More like a circulation system, veins of black stone pulsing through the early world. And here's the thing about obsidian. It isn't just pretty. It's lethal. Sharper than surgical steel. When fractured properly, it produces edges measured in microns, perfect for cutting, perfect for ritual, perfect for violence. Where obsidian appears, so do knives, blades, arrowheads, scrapers, and scalpels. Some were used for hunting, some for ceremony, some for cutting flesh with precision too advanced for crude survival. Which brings us to the question, were the Obsidian Traders just middlemen carrying stone from volcano to village, or were they something more? Technologists? Priests? Assassins? The sheer distances involved suggest more than simple barter. Obsidian from Anatolia ends up in Jericho. Ethiopian obsidian shows up deep in Nubia. Some of it was transported over 2,000 kilometers without wheels, without pack animals, through terrain so brutal it would kill a modern hiker in days. You don't do that unless what you're carrying is more than just a tool. You do that for power. Some theorists believe the Obsidian Traders were part of a ritual economy, a prehistoric black market for sacred blades. Each volcanic source was considered alive, imbued with spirit. Carrying stone from a volcano wasn't just transport, it was communion. And when you gave someone an obsidian blade from a mountain they'd never seen, you weren't just trading material. You were transferring power, prestige, access to a source no one else could touch. These blades weren't generic. They were named, identifiable, unique. In a world without writing, the stone was the message. That makes the Obsidian Traders curators of knowledge, or perhaps hoarders. They didn't leave temples, but their product was found in them. Obsidian blades have been uncovered in graves, offerings, sacred pits, sometimes broken intentionally, sometimes placed on the tongue of the dead, like coins, like keys, like silencers. And the routes they traveled, if you can call them that, cut through dangerous land, through deserts, mountains, marshes, through zones claimed by other cultures, other gods, other hunters, and yet, the obsidian got through, which means the traders were untouchable. They may have been feared, protected by taboo, carriers of death in black glass. They didn't need cities. They had infrastructure of myth, places to sleep known only to them, springs marked with stones. nighttime paths visible only under stars. They may have used relay networks, nodes, caches of goods hidden along the way, prehistoric drop points, no written records, just inherited directions, passed down mouth to mouth, shadow to shadow. And if they were caught? Well, obsidian is easy to make vanish. Break it, bury it, let it glitter under the sand for 10,000 years until someone with a trowel stabs it free again. What's left today is the distribution map, a sprawl of black stars scattered across early human settlements. No origin story, no founders, just paths, just purpose. They didn't conquer, they didn't farm, they didn't build, they moved. And as they disappeared into time, the black glass they left behind whispered something else. That civilization might not have begun in temples or markets, but in exchange, not of ideas, but of edges. And while the Obsidian Traders vanished into the dust, their knives remained, waiting. But while they dealt in death with precision, another culture rose not to cut the body, but to pierce the sky. A people who built with alignment, who shaped stone into messages only the stars could read. They were called the Sky Pyramid Builders. And they didn't look down. They looked up, Sky Pyramid Builders. There are pyramids built to bury kings. There are pyramids built to impress gods. But the Sky Pyramid Builders, if they existed, built not for rulers or religion. They built for the stars. No records name them. No texts describe their rituals. They left behind no empires, no myths etched in stone, but scattered across the pre-dynastic map of the ancient world, long before Giza cast its perfect shadow, there are structures, alignments, and elevations that suggest a different kind of purpose. Not funerary, not symbolic, celestial. The theory is simple and terrifying. Before the rise of dynastic Egypt, a group or network of early peoples constructed stone structures aligned with the sky not by accident, but by calculation. They weren't just tracking stars. They were syncing to them. This idea doesn't come from wishful thinking. It comes from patterns, from stone mounds, platform foundations, and primitive enclosures found scattered across the Nile Valley, the Sahara, and other ancient floodplains, often dismissed as tribal shelters or early tombs. But then someone looked closer. The orientations didn't point north-south. They didn't follow river curves or wind patterns. They pointed to rising constellations, to equinox sunrises, to precession points that shift over thousands of years. These weren't just structures. They were observatories. Rough ones, yes, more like outlines than buildings. Megalithic rings, low ridges, buried sightlines marked by stone. But the precision is undeniable. Sites that align to Orion, to Sirius, to the Pleiades. Not once, not randomly, consistently. That's where the Sky Pyramid Builder theory takes root. It suggests that long before Egyptian astronomy formalized its zodiac, before priesthoods mapped calendars by lunar cycles, a shadow society was already watching the stars not just for timekeeping, but as part of a cosmological infrastructure. They may not have built pyramids as we imagine them, pointed, perfect, monumental, but the form was already emerging: high ground, sloped sides, elevation, orientation. A pyramid not for burial, but for correlation. A platform between heaven and earth, not to ascend to gods, but to mirror them. Because the earliest Egyptian pyramids don't emerge from chaos. They follow a logic, and the oldest of them at Saqqara, at Meidum, inherit a geometry that seems too refined for a first draft. Where did it come from? Who laid the foundations, not in stone, but in thought? The Sky Pyramid Builders might have been semi-nomadic, seasonal ritualists who returned each year to realign, recalibrate, re-record. They may have mapped star paths using crude gnomons and horizon markers. Some may have been obsidian users carrying glass and time across zones of trade and myth. They didn't need writing. They had position. Some believe they built pre-pyramidal terraces, flat platforms on which early rituals took place, dedicated not to ancestors or weather, but to the celestial calendar itself. These platforms may have been clay or stone, now long eroded, miscategorized as natural rises or eroded tombs. But what if they were proto-pyramids? The training ground for monumentality, the chalk lines before the chisel. And the more chilling idea? They may not have been alone. Sky pyramid-like structures pop up in Nubia, Ethiopia, even the Sahara, not full pyramids, but elevated alignments, geometric land modifications, raised mounds that track solar or stellar events. Too similar to be coincidence. Too early to be borrowed. That suggests either shared origin or shared influence. Some theorists point to a now lost trans-regional knowledge network, a ritual calendar carried by trade, by marriage, by seasonal gathering. The idea that pyramid building wasn't invented in Egypt, but inherited, passed through memory, through sacred alignments, through architecture as astronomy. Even the word pyramid becomes misleading here. These weren't tombs. They were devices, cosmic receivers, platforms for the living to interact with the heavens, and perhaps for the stars to watch back. And then nothing. The sky pyramid builders disappear, or more likely, they dissolve into Egypt itself. Their techniques formalized, their rituals absorbed, their platforms buried beneath grander, more permanent monuments. They were too early. Their raw observatories became blueprints for pharaohs. Their celestial logic, once functional, became theological, recast as divine alignment, instead of inherited technique. And like all ancestors of genius, they were forgotten. But not completely, because the stars they watched still move, and the monuments we marvel at today still follow their ancient logic. The sky pyramid builders are gone, but their ghost aligns with every sunrise over Giza. And beyond the pyramids, downriver where the delta kisses the sea, another group once watched the tides rise, not to chart the sky, but to survive its wrath. They were amphibians of mud and salt. The delta tidewalkers. And they didn't build to last. They adapted to drown. Delta tidewalkers. They didn't leave behind pyramids, or cities, or temples chiseled into permanence. What they left behind was silt, fish bones, crushed shells, and a mystery that rises and falls with the tide. The delta tidewalkers are not a confirmed civilization. They're a speculative population, whispered into being by the faintest geological clues, the kind that show up in the underlayers of Egypt's Nile Delta. We're talking thousands of years before dynasties. Possibly as early as 6000 BCE, maybe earlier. Long before the Delta was the green fan of fertility we see in textbooks, it was a chaotic marsh, a zone of intertidal terror, salt flats, lagoons, unstable channels, shifting coastlines. A place that should have repelled permanent settlement. And yet, someone stayed. They didn't just survive, they moved with it. That's the central horror of the Delta Tidewalkers. Their mastery wasn't over stone, or flame, or metal. It was over impermanence. Most early civilizations avoided estuarine deltas. Too volatile, too hard to map, much less farm. But the Tidewalkers, if they existed, chose to live within the volatility. Their world changed monthly, daily, hourly. They didn't try to control the tides. They walked them. Archaeologists have found odd traces, shell middens buried beneath modern agricultural zones, fish traps made of reeds and stakes, now fossilized into abstract patterns, tiny clay discs with holes, possibly net weights, crude plank pathways that seem to lead into nothing marshland long since swallowed. But when mapped across time layers, they suggest movement, migration across predictable tidal shifts, like someone had mapped the delta's rhythm not with charts, but with footsteps. Their homes weren't fixed, they were floating. Raft dwellings, reed huts, maybe early stilt constructions. Nothing durable, nothing sacred. The delta didn't allow permanence. It punished it. The Tidewalkers didn't build temples, they built paths. And they may have been the first amphibious culture, not in biology, but in mindset. Part land, part water, part present, part future. They had to know what was coming, because if they didn't, they drowned. That's how you get prophecy before gods. Some researchers theorize that their calendar, if they had one, wasn't solar or lunar but tidal, marked not by stars or seasons, but by the breathing of the sea. Imagine that. A time system based not on heaven, but on the pull of the moon felt through your ankles. And the foods they ate, brackish water species, marsh fish, mud eels, salt-hardy plants, show up in places they shouldn't. In early inland communities, traces of delta cuisine are found hundreds of miles upstream, which means the Tidewalkers didn't just stay put. They traded. Their marshland knowledge, how to preserve fish in salt, how to dry reeds into rope, how to navigate tide channels at night was valuable, maybe even sacred. There's a possibility they were guides, ferrymen, pilots of the marsh, trusted to lead others through what looked like death. Because to the uninitiated, the delta was a nightmare. Flat, featureless, drowning in fog and biting insects, crocodiles in the brackish pools, sudden drop-offs, reeds so thick they could trap and kill a grown man. But the Tidewalkers saw the grid. They understood the delta's logic. They may have even shaped it. There are theories, unconfirmed, dangerous, poetic, that the earliest Nile canal systems were modeled after delta paths, that irrigation ditches mimic tidal drainage, that the entire Egyptian relationship with water began not in Upper Egypt with the grain farmers, but down here, in the mud, with the ones who didn't fear the flood. But they left no myths, because they left no names. They were too fluid to be remembered. Their memory survived only in habit, in rituals for boat launching, in coastal funerals, in salt offerings, in myths of flood and rebirth that came later, stripped of context, framed as legend. Even the concept of Osiris, god of the Nile, of death and return, may echo back to them, not as a deity, but as a pattern, a myth built from their lived experience of daily submersion and emergence. And when the Nile Delta began to stabilize, when agriculture took over, when fixed settlements replaced floating ones, the Tidewalkers vanished, not through collapse, through incompatibility. They were erased not by disaster, but by progress. A progress that preferred bricks over rafts, borders over tides, timepieces over moons. But every time the delta floods wrong, every time the sea takes back more than expected, every time a modern archaeologist finds fish bones where there should be none, they whisper. And beyond the marshes, further inland, stone quarries begin to appear. Rough, early cuts, tools shaped by wind and will, and rumors of a caste, not of builders, but of seers. They were called the Quarry Seers, and their vision was not for the gods. It was for the stone itself. Quarry Seers. Before the pyramids reached for the heavens, before the obelisks pierced the sky like frozen lightning, there were the Quarry Seers, a semi-mythical caste of proto-masons who did not just carve stone. They spoke to it. That's the legend, anyway. There are no temples with their names, no tombs, no scrolls, no statues. What survives are tools primitive, worn, unornamented. Flint picks, diorite hammers, and mysterious chalked symbols left behind in the deepest veins of forgotten quarries. Not random scratches, not tool marks. Deliberate signs. And here's where it gets eerie. These early marks found in abandoned pre-dynastic extraction sites across Egypt and Nubia are often located beneath later dynastic quarries. as if the pharaohs had simply repurposed sacred ground without understanding it, as if someone had already been there, mapping the fractures, reading the grain of the rock, not just extracting stone, divining it. The Quarry Seers, as imagined by fringe theorists and speculative historians, weren't laborers. They were interpreters, early specialists who saw in sandstone and granite something more than raw material. They believed the stone had memory, that every block held a resonance, that certain cliffs were not to be broken and others not to be touched unless under precise celestial conditions. That's what sets them apart from later stonemasons. They didn't shape stone for glory. They listened to it. Some quarries bear traces of this. Walls intentionally left uncut, though easier to reach. Stone pillars abandoned mid-harvest not due to flaws, but something else. Something ritual. Core samples suggest they were bypassing perfectly usable stone for harder-to-reach veins. Their criteria were not economic. They were esoteric. In one such site, near the edge of the eastern desert, a strange pattern emerges. Columns half-chiseled, their surfaces etched with concentric circles, spirals, and what some interpret as primitive eye motifs. The same symbol appears in several early rock shelters over 100 kilometers apart. Coincidence? Maybe. But perhaps it was a glyph, a sigil, a warning, or an invitation. The Quarry Seers may have seen themselves not as extractors, but as mediators between the living and the stone. Their speculation unconfirmed, yet persistent, that they held ritual processions before quarrying. That stone was awakened, not taken. That each block removed was disenchanted through rhythm, chant, percussion, flame. Early percussion marks on cliff faces support this. Traces of repeated tapping in specific acoustic patterns, not consistent with labor, but with resonance testing. They may have chosen stone not for quality, but for sound. Yes, sound. Certain types of granite ring when struck. Some limestone resonates like a drum. What if they were mapping the tone of the landscape, selecting blocks not just for building, but for ritual frequency? Imagine it. Temples not just aligned with stars, but tuned like instruments. These proto-masons weren't just planning structures. They were sculpting vibration. And when they did cut, it was precise. Even in the most rudimentary layers of extraction, cuts follow clean, geometric patterns, vertical, angular, following not ease but form. Many later pyramids and mastabas incorporate stone taken from these sites. Some theorists believe the early kings sought out these quarries not for quality, but for legacy, for proximity to the seers. But eventually, the Quarry Seers vanish. Not because they were conquered, because they became obsolete. As labor systems scaled and stone became economics instead of metaphysics, the seers were replaced. Not by priests, by foremen. Quarrying turned into industry. The sacred became procedural. The glyphs stopped. The chants fell silent. The old marks were chiseled over. Their memory turned to dust under the weight of dynastic pragmatism. And yet, their ghost lingers in the stones, in unfinished blocks left deep in tunnels, in tools placed intentionally beside abandoned cuts, in forgotten quarry temples that face not east to the rising sun but inward, into the cliffs themselves. Because the Quarry Seers were not looking to elevate kings. They were trying to free something from inside the earth. And some believe they succeeded. Legends speak of singing stones, blocks that resisted erosion for millennia, temples that never cracked despite floods and quakes, whispered stories of foundation stones that hum under specific star alignments. And if those stories are true, then the seers were more than masons. They were engineers of frequency. But when you understand stone as voice, what do you do when it stops speaking? You weave. You twist. You pull new meaning from fibers, from sand, from silence. And so the seers gave way to another lineage, not of stone cutters, but of weavers. Nomads who threaded the desert like loom string, who left behind no monuments, but miles of pattern. The desert thread nomads. And they didn't carve their knowledge into stone. They wore it on their skin. Desert thread nomads. They didn't build. They didn't conquer. They didn't write their names in stone or paint gods on walls. Instead, they wove their memory into fiber, into thread, into clothing so intricate, so patterned, so persistent in motif that thousands of years later, their ghost lingers not in ruins, but in texture. The desert thread nomads are a semi-mythical people suspected to have roamed Egypt's western oases, the shifting sand basins between the Libyan Plateau and the Nile Valley, sometime between 4,500 and 3,000 BCE. They appear in no king lists. They founded no cities. But their fingerprints remain in early textile impressions, in dyes absorbed by linen, in spiraled cord fragments unearthed from long-dead graves. This is their tragedy and their triumph. They left no stone behind, but they left pattern. And the pattern speaks. It speaks of movement, of sand trails charted not with roads, but with thread counts, of family lines tracked through weaving styles, not techniques, loom preferences, of tribal memory embedded in warp and weft. To them, a garment wasn't just fabric. It was identity. And identity, in the desert, was protection. They didn't farm, not in the traditional sense. They traveled, between oases, between floodplains, between rock shelters and trade posts, not aimless, not wandering, seasonal, strategic. They knew where water would be, not just this year but 10 years from now. They tracked shifting dunes with the precision of mathematicians. Some scholars suggest they used a kind of textile map, large woven pieces encoding directional cues, symbols for water, danger, shelter, not abstract symbols but tactile memory. Threads you could read with your fingers, even in the dark. Others propose a system of lineage flags, small woven panels worn or hung, denoting tribal identity, ancestor allegiance, trade access, each pattern a declaration, not of wealth, but of belonging. And what makes them terrifying, what makes them real, is the consistency. Across widely separated regions, Dakhla, Oasis, Karga, Faiyum textile patterns emerge with startling parallels. Chevron motifs, spiral bands, diamond nets. You can trace them like language families. Follow the mutations, the borrowings, the rivalries. They didn't build empires. They wove influence, and they were useful. Early Nile cultures needed movement, couriers, traders, guides, people who could vanish into sand and return, with obsidian, resin, stories, and salt. The desert thread nomads were interfacers. They knew the borderlands. They knew the edge. They likely served as go-betweens negotiating between settled grain farmers and distant, volatile exchange partners, sometimes envoys, sometimes smugglers, always interpreters. And interpreters need memory. Not written in ink, written in thread, which brings us to the ritual side. Some burial sites suggest textile funerary shrouds, not generic wrappings, but coded garments, wrappings that told not just who you were, but what you carried. Threads dyed with rare pigments, blue lotus, red ochre, iron bark tannin, not decorative, symbolic, territorial. Some of these fibers, when chemically analyzed, contain dyes not local to Egypt, dyes that trace back to Levantine hills, to eastern desert routes, even to Nubian forests, meaning their roots stretched farther than their name suggests. They were not just desert walkers. They were thread bridges between worlds. And the most disturbing theory? They encoded oral history in textile pattern. A repeated spiral motif might mark a flood. A doubled chevron might symbolize a failed harvest. Each weaving family preserved a chapter, the garment as history book, worn on bodies, buried in sand. In this theory, war was recorded not in epic poem but in stitch tension. Some say they wove omens, that specific patterns were banned from wear during certain moon phases. That some garments were never meant to be worn, only burned. That there were curse weavers, initiates trained to bind misfortune into ceremonial cloth, then unravel it as a form of protection. And then, like all stories too fluid for walls, they disappeared. No collapse, just absorption. Their motifs diluted into Egyptian textile design, their colors rebranded as pharaonic preferences, their weaving lore turned into superstition. The thread became rope, the message became background. But every time an archaeologist unrolls a scrap of linen from a nameless grave and sees a spiral stitched with near-machine precision, a fragment of the desert thread Nomads whispers. And if you listen hard enough, you might still hear the song of the loom, the voice of a people who never raised temples, never crowned kings, but mapped the world through fabric. And beyond the oases, deeper into Egypt's botanical heart, there were others, not weavers, not masons, not engineers. They were keepers of a flower that numbed pain, unlocked visions, and maybe, just maybe, opened doors to the divine. They were the Blue Lotus Keepers, and they did not speak. They drank. Blue Lotus Keepers. In ancient Egypt, the blue lotus was everywhere, painted in tombs, carved in temple reliefs, clutched in the hands of gods and kings. But before it was a symbol of rebirth or an offering to Osiris. Before it bloomed in sacred ponds at Karnak and perfumed the banquets of Thebes, it was something else. A threshold. And someone guarded it. Enter the Blue Lotus Keepers, a speculative cult or proto-society that existed before written language, before dynasties, possibly before organized agriculture. They are remembered, if at all, through residue. Dried petals buried with bones, pollen trapped in jars, faint chemical traces found on ceremonial cups. But to understand them, you have to forget the flower as decoration. Forget the perfume. Forget the pretty. This wasn't a plant. It was pharmacology. Nymphaea caerulea, the sacred blue lotus, contains psychoactive compounds, alkaloids, that, when steeped in wine or smoked, produce euphoria, mild hallucinations, and states of trance. Not enough to knock you unconscious, just enough to unseal a door. And that's what the keepers were chasing. Not intoxication. Initiation. The Blue Lotus Keepers, if they existed, were not farmers. They were florists of the divine, early ritualists who cultivated, prepared, and administered the flower not for beauty, but for transcendence. Their role was not medicinal. It was metaphysical. Their job wasn't to heal the body. It was to fracture the mind and let something else come in. Some of the earliest evidence of Blue Lotus use is not from temples, but from burial pits graves dated to the pre-dynastic era, where dried blossoms were packed alongside beads, teeth, and animal bones. The presence of the flower, fragile, hard to preserve, suggests something more than aesthetic. It was essential, and in some cases, the flowers were found pressed into what appeared to be ritual cups, small vessels stained with residues that, under chemical analysis, show signs of fermented liquid, likely wine. Imagine it. A darkened hut, smoke rising, a small group of initiates seated in a circle. The wine poured, the flowers steeped, the chanting low and rhythmic. This wasn't recreation. It was contact. The keepers, in this speculative model, were the first Egyptian shamanic caste, proto-priests, who used the blue lotus to explore altered states, to speak with the dead, to witness ancestral memories, to walk the fields of the beyond and return intact. Their practices may have involved submersion rituals, ceremonies in shallow lotus ponds where the flower grew. Water, symbolism, and psychotropics fused into one. Some theorists suggest they believed the spirit entered the body not through breath but through fluid. Hence the importance of steeping, of soaking, of drinking. They left behind no scripture, but some of their icons may have survived not as names, but as postures. In later Egyptian art, gods like Nefertem and Harpocrates are shown emerging from the lotus, seated, eyes closed, as if mid-trance. These figures don't speak. They sit, they radiate, they listen. They are not rulers. They are witnesses. And that was the keeper's role. Not to command, but to observe, to relay, to document without writing. Some believe the flower's shape informed early glyphs, that the symbol for emergence, birth, or even consciousness evolved from how the flower opens daily, with the sun like a third eye blooming. And their knowledge passed through taste, recipes, dosages, timing. These weren't carved in stone. They were remembered in tongue and throat, a lineage of flavor passed from elder to apprentice. The right steeping time, the right water, the right moment in the lunar cycle. To get it wrong was to drown in vision. To get it right was to step outside time. Some fringe interpretations go further. They claim the keepers foresaw death rituals thousands of years before mummification, that the idea of the Ka, the soul that survives death, originated in the blue lotus trance, that the keepers didn't just witness visions, they saw selves detaching. And in those moments, in that split between perception and surrender, they learned something no pharaoh ever mastered, that the afterlife is not a place. It's a pattern, a shape, a cycle that you can only glimpse with the proper brew, at the proper depth, under the proper Sunday. And then they vanished. Not destroyed, not forgotten, just transformed. Their rituals cannibalized by temple cults. Their flower claimed by kings and priests. Their sacred intoxicant turned into banquet garnish. Their trances rebranded as divine prophecy. But even now, in the reeds of the Nile, the blue lotus grows wild. And somewhere in that smell, half honey, half shadow, something stirs. The keepers are gone, but the door they opened, still cracked. And far downriver, near the ancient river mouth, another group was beginning their own experiments, not with plants, not with stone, but with symbols. The Rivermouth Scribes, the ones who wrote before writing. And what they recorded? No one can read. Rivermouth Scribes. Before the gods had names, before hieroglyphs took flight across temple walls, before the Rosetta Stone ever dreamed of decoding a language, there were marks, not words, not pictures, just shapes. Scrawled into clay, scratched into bone, carved into driftwood, carried by the Nile's slow breath. They were left by the Rivermouth Scribes, a speculative, pre-literate society that flourished around the Nile Delta, possibly between 5000 and 3500 BCE, in the twilight zone where water met silt and meaning met mutation. They didn't write sentences. They didn't write prayers. What they wrote was something more primitive, more uncertain, and maybe more dangerous. Proto-symbols. And not for storytelling. For tracking reality. The Rivermouth Scribes, if they ever existed, were not scribes in the traditional sense. They weren't record keepers for a pharaoh. They weren't temple bureaucrats. They weren't artists. They were counters of chaos, individuals who recognized, long before written language, that the world could be measured. And what better place to measure than the mouth of the river, where the flood meets the sea, where fresh water tangles with salt and the land itself rewrites its shape every generation. Their symbols weren't decorative, they were functional. Early attempts to trap the intangible, the rise of the flood, the weight of fish, the phases of the moon, the timing of migration, the cycles of rot and bloom and death. Every carved line was a guess, an equation drawn in mud and intuition. And it wasn't random, because these symbols appear, repeatedly, on bone, on ceramic, on reed mats hardened in clay. In some cases, the same marks show up across separate archaeological sites, up to 300 kilometers apart, with uncanny consistency. A zigzag, a circle with 4 points, a set of parallel scratches. Always grouped, never identical, always deliberate. They weren't words, they were tools. Imagine a world before grammar, before phonetics, before even the idea that thoughts could be made permanent. That's what the scribes were up against. They weren't trying to create art. They were trying to externalize prediction. To see the flood before it came. Some believe the Rivermouth Scribes were proto-engineers, early hydrologists who used symbols to mark seasonal overflow, to track where the Nile would rise, breach, fall. They may have developed systems to guide irrigation long before anyone built canals. Their symbols may have warned, too soon to plant, too late to harvest, this ground will drown. Others suggest something more spiritual, that these proto-symbols weren't just measurements, but offerings. That to mark the edge of the world, the meeting of river and sea was to participate in cosmic accounting. That the scribes were not just observers, but participants in the Nile's dream. And dreams, in their world, were not fiction. They were data. Some fragments even show up in burial contexts, symbols etched into the inner curve of bowls, the underside of lids, the backs of blades, not for the living to see, for the dead, a kind of invisible script, as if the symbols weren't meant to be read, but recognized. Which raises an unsettling idea, that the Rivermouth Scribes weren't just tracking the world, they were training the next one. Their knowledge was fragile. There was no ink, no libraries. Everything was carried in pattern, passed mouth to mouth, hand to hand. Each scribe initiated through repetition, correction, ritual, until the symbols became reflex, until the river was no longer something feared, but something mapped. They didn't leave behind empires. They left interfaces, but they didn't last. When the rise of Naqada culture swept across Egypt, symbols evolved into true writing, pictographs with syntax, names of kings, dates, laws. Suddenly, everything had to mean more. The scribes' proto-symbols were now noise useless, vague, untranslatable. And yet, their bones still show up at the river's edge, sometimes with their tools, sometimes with their symbols, always near water, as if even in death they couldn't bear to leave the edge of the Nile, as if they believed the flood would return and they would rise with it, symbols in hand, ready to chart again. And maybe they were right, because every language has its proto-language, every glyph has its seed. Every word is a scar from a time when we were still learning how to make thought solid. The Rivermouth Scribes were trying to turn the river into a sentence. And that sentence? Still unfinished. But while they carved the future into clay, far upstream, another people were busy rewriting the past, not with symbols, but with bodies. A culture of bone readers, night flesh sculptors, and skull whisperers. They were called the Qadan. And they didn't write. They cut.